Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode of the Embellish Podcast, an opportunity for me to ramble about whiskey or something or anything for a few minutes, or even get the opportunity to interview some folks. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. If you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com, and I'll try to get that taken care of. You can find all of my links on Instagram at EmbellishPod. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Enough of the housekeeping. This evening, I have Doug, DemiTastes, a man of many, many links, which you should be able to find in the show notes on this. But I'll give him a chance to kind of introduce himself, and then we'll get into the meat of the conversation.
Yeah, hi. I'm DemiTastes. My real name is Doug, but I mostly just go by DemiTastes around the internet. I am first and foremost a whiskey nerd. Um, I got started basically just drinking what I felt was interesting, and then I realized that I sort of had thoughts and tasting notes sort of came naturally to me, so I started writing reviews. Pandemic came along, I joined some online communities, figured out there's a whole bunch of people like me. It's a good way to have a dialogue and learn new things. And the more you learn, the more you want to learn, and then the more you want to share. At least somebody like me, I have sort of a side passion for introducing people to things. I wouldn't say teaching necessarily because I think I'm probably best at explaining things to people who know almost as much as I do, which isn't really great for bringing newbies in, but I'm always practicing that skill. Um, Across lots of different things. You kind of have a list of stuff that I'm interested in, but besides whiskey, I'm into music. I've been playing viola for 22 years, I think. Mostly in a hobby capacity, but I was really serious about it in high school and college. I'm also an athlete. I've always been doing something, usually on the water. Currently, I'm doing dragon boat. So, also I'm an engineer, so using my brain all day long. I always have to balance these things, right? My brain work and my physical work, athletics against this thing that is bad for all of those things, drinking whiskey.
Yep.
And so I'm also a big advocate for dry weeks and moderation.
Mhm.
And that's kind of there's a whole ethos that goes into that. I'm sure we'll get real deep into it today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this hobby is effectively about consuming poison. I mean, like we are literally just drinking small quantities of poison for our own enjoyment, which is there's probably some sort of therapist communication that we probably need to have, but we'll hold that for another time because I don't know that either one of us is qualified for that. I know I'm not. I did poke around on who Doug really is quite a bit for the last couple of days. I didn't see therapist on there.
Nope, that's not me. I'm an engineer,
So how did you
computer
get into
scientist by
whiskey to
learning and
begin
trade.
with? Like where does this come from? Because very few people, and I've heard this before. Like these things are acquired taste. It's wine, it's whiskey, it's beer, it's whatever. Now that wasn't necessarily the case for me. I don't know if I was the weirdo or not, but it was never a thing. But usually there's this like moment that it goes from like a casual college person type interaction with alcohol consumption to now I'm a little bit nerdy about it.
Yeah, I don't know if I could put my finger on directly when that happened exactly. Um, but I'll say that and you've talked about the wink and the nudge of like, oh, I never had a drink before I was 21. That is absolutely 100% the truth for me.
Mm-hmm.
I was always a rules follower. So before I turned 21, I only ever had a drink of a sip of wine or beer here and there, maybe like New Year's Day, something like that. Um, on my 21st birthday, I happened to be in Seattle, the Seattle area where I live now. I was in Seattle for an interview. Um, and a good friend of mine, his parents actually took me out to dinner, and on my birthday, bought me my first drink of wine, which went very badly. It it wasn't that I was overly intoxicated. It just really upset my stomach,
Mm-hmm.
which is a horrible thing to have happen the night before an interview. And so for that and other reasons, I think I kind of bounced off of wine pretty hard. I kept coming back to it, and it always kind of something about wine. Maybe other people have experienced this. Something about wine, especially red wine, kind of makes me feel funny,
Mm-hmm.
like not in an alcohol way, but like in my head feels hot or my stomach feels queasy, something like that. So I always kind of felt like I think growing up, me and my friends felt that I would be the kind of person to get into fancy things. which I think for the most part hasn't really happened. I think that came from like I play viola, which is kind of a pretentious. I mean, it's not as pretentious as violin. I have to throw in the violin jokes. Um, but playing classical music is a little on the pretentious side, and I think people say, "Oh, classical music goes with wine. Doug's going to be a wine drinker." None of that happened. I pretty much drinking didn't really appeal to me a whole lot until I think I didn't really get into it until I was about 23 years old. And I had a work team that liked to go out on Fridays and have lunch with beers. And it was like a specialty bar with like lots of rotating taps and specialty beers. And I got to try a lot of different things and realized that within this one category of alcohol, it's not just I didn't like the kind of beer that you drink in college, like the really light, I think Bud Light Platinum was probably the best of the things I had in those days. Which, if you mix that with orange juice, you get something pretty close to a mimosa. Just gonna throw that out there. um,
Haven't heard that one before. I'm gonna have to put that on the list of things to not try.
yeah, you'd be perfectly fine to not try it, I think.
Right.
Um, yeah, so realizing that there's this whole breadth of interesting things to find in one type of beverage, I think sort of opened my mind up to the idea that there was more breadth to be had in things like whiskey, where in college it was just, Jack Daniels, occasionally the Maker's Mark, Crown Royal. Those Maker's Mark and Crown Royal were the fancy versions of
Yep.
if you're drinking whiskey at a party. And I just kind of like, I was like, oh, this is kind of boring, right? I pretty quickly figured out that I didn't like to drink to become intoxicated.
Hmm.
And so things that weren't flavorful to me were not things that I enjoyed. So it was beer and cocktails for me for a long time. But in the midst of all that, I got to have a bourbon now and then with dad. And actually, I think the first thing that really captured my attention was Wild Turkey 81.
Okay.
Um, I think it was because it had that low enough proof that it was accessible to me, and that flavor profile was just really nice for me. Um, I think that's pretty much where it stopped for a while. I pretty much just went between Wild Turkey and Maker's Mark. Whenever I ran out of one, I would buy the other, or sometimes I'd take a chance on something I saw on the shelf. And that was years and years of whiskey at home because whiskey's too expensive to drink when you're out. If I'm going to spend $9 on a whiskey, I might as well spend $7 on a beer that I like better.
Hmm.
Was pretty much the thinking. So then I went to Japan in 2015, and this was just around the time where Japanese whiskey was kind of taking off. And I took it upon myself to go hunt for Yamazaki 12 because I'd heard that was really good. I found it for the equivalent of I think about 60 US dollars, which is like an unheard of price for Yamazaki 12 these days. Really liked that. Got it as gifts for my dad and my father-in-law, and I think that was sort of like, oh, this is whiskey that can be fancy. And then after that, I bought a Nika 12, which is hard to get if it even exists anymore these days. It's
Hmm.
sort of like Japanese whiskey ended up being like, this is the I'm gonna have this on special occasions drink, and I felt myself more and more pulled to drinking that sort of thing. Like I was looking forward to those things more, the highly flavorful special occasion drinks, as opposed to the everyday drink of whiskey wasn't really something that appealed to me. And beer at some point, like for athletic reasons, like I wanted to control my weight a little better. Um, I sort of petered off of drinking beer, I guess. And whiskey ended up being more and more the thing, but there was still just kind of a big break where I wasn't drinking much of anything. And the pandemic came along, and I said, well, we've got this little pandemic pod. I think a lot of people had that, right? You've got like
Hmm.
six people or so, maybe, that you all see each other and you don't see anybody else. And this is a way of keeping your exposure down. And I said, well, we're not going to bars and we've kind of been drinking the same stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build a cocktail bar. I'm going to build a cocktail cart. And what I'm going to do is every time we get together, I'm going to buy a new ingredient
Hmm.
and I'm going to build a cocktail around that. And that's going to be the drink of the night. That lasted for about a month or two, maybe. I bought a bottle of all things, a Reposado Mezcal, and sort of went, oh, like this is a whole brand new thing, and it's smoky in a way that like that Dewar's White Label I had years ago and didn't like was smoky, but like in a way better way. And I'm thinking, oh, like maybe because I've had spirits for a while in the context of cocktails, maybe I have more of an appreciation for this sort of stuff now. Let me go back and try scotch. So I went on Reddit. This is the moment I discovered the Reddit whiskey circles. I went on Reddit and found the scotch subreddit, and I was looking for they had this whole list of resources. I They had recommendation threads. It was actually like a great booming place to find stuff if you wanted to know. And I was kind of going, Japanese whiskey is like getting hard to find. It's too expensive now. Um, what am I going to buy? And they actually had a guide. If you like this Japanese whiskey, you should try this Scotch. And so I kind of started there and made a wish list. And then for my birthday that year, we went on a shopping spree, Total Wine. I bought like a Nika from the barrel, which so like I'm still in that Japanese wheelhouse, but it's like mostly Ben Nevis. People kind of know now. Um, I bought some. I don't even remember the other stuff that I bought. I think I bought a Dewar's. If I'm not mistaken, I think one of the bottles I bought on that occasion was this Dewar's Illegal Smooth that I was. And this I bought because hey, that's mezcal. Like that's kind of my connection back to spirits and also Scotch, and it's a
Hmm.
nice little transition piece. Maybe if you check the year that came out, you'll find out that that can't possibly have been 2020 when I bought that. That might have been a future shopping spree. But
Hmm.
I bought a few different things. Started exploring. I bought two Irish whiskeys, I think. One of them was Redbreast 12. Um, and I also bought like a little of the coffee Jameson.
Hmm.
Um, the Jameson Cold Brew. And sort of it was like Jameson Cold Brew, Tullamore Dew, and Redbreast 12. I got together with a buddy of mine who plays trombone, and also enjoys drinking whiskey on occasion. And we actually were like, let's just try and write a review. Like, let's just try, see how it goes. And I think we did a good job. That ended up being like review number 3 to 5 that I posted or something early in those numbers. I wasn't the first thing I posted because I wasn't confident yet. Um, Actually, there's a whole period of time. There's reviews I held back just because I wasn't confident in my tasting notes, let alone my scores. I ended up revising almost none of them in retrospect. I
Hmm.
finally had to have just a friend from the Whiskey Lodge, which was the Discord community that I joined, and now I admin and moderate. Um, he was like, "Hey, like, just trust yourself. Like, what you thought then was totally valid. Just like
Hmm.
publish that, right? Don't don't get all up in your head." And I love telling people that, right? I want to hear what you think about the whiskey. I don't want you to be overanalyzing whether you had good thoughts or whether you wrote it well or whatever. I just want to know what you thought because we're having a conversation, and that's a great starting point for a conversation. I think of my reviews that way. I hope people find my reviews and say, "Oh, that was helpful." I know this person's palate and
Hmm.
maybe I've liked the other things they've recommended or I agree with them on this or that. This helps me find something I'd like or something that I don't want. Um, I hope that, but more than that, what I really enjoy is the conversations to start because I published a review or even just a couple of tasting notes and some basic thoughts. Like recently, I tried Johnny Walker Blue Label for the first time, which around here is a $250 bottle. And I felt it was aggressively mid. And that was
Yeah.
my take. And I love when, like, I know that that's going to be a hot take. And I love going into the Whiskey Lodge because it's full of people who think like me, basically, where like nobody's going to walk in there and pretty much say, like, oh, no, Blue Label is the best thing ever. You're completely wrong for having that opinion. Like, I know I can take that opinion in there and be like, hey, I had Blue Label. I thought it was kind of aggressively just mid tier, like 5 out of 10, maybe a 6 out of
Hmm.
10 on a good day. What is, I think maybe this is better, or I've had things that are worse or whatever. And like we can have a conversation from that starting point where it's like, oh yeah, I also didn't like Blue Label. And almost always somebody chimes in with Green Label's really the best Johnny Walker. And like all these online communities sort of have these memes that sort of grow out of them. Anyway, I've been talking for a long time about like my travels through whiskey. Maybe
Yeah.
we
So
can get
it's
more
it's
specific.
it's an interesting star map, and I'm going to touch on the Blue Label Johnny Walker, and I think this is a thing that's pervasive across any spirit community that I've ever seen, and largely it's you need a brand that has a high degree of notoriety in its label, like a lot of people know it, and then whatever their premier thing is, that's gonna become the thing that people that are new to it, like you can be like, Blue Label Johnny Walker is great, and a whole bunch of people are gonna know what that is, whereas people like you, people like me, people that once you kind of get into the groove a little bit, you start finding these other things that are significantly better. But if you walk into a bar full of people that have average whiskey knowledge, they're not going to know what you're even talking about, right? Like an example is, and it's one of my favorites. I've got a Wild Turkey Father and Son 13 year, right? that's an England only export. It's a 13-year-old, but all they hear is wild turkey, and they're like, whatever. Like you go to
Yeah.
somebody that just sort of knows something about whiskey, and they're gonna sort of poo poo on it because it didn't have the initial brand notoriety that a Pappy's gonna have or whatever, right? But I think that it's significantly better than any of those others. But you're the star map of your spirit's journey is beer to maker slash wild turkey to Japanese whiskey to mezcal to scotch. Like
Yep.
that's
That's pretty
super
much it.
weird.
I really should have reduced it that way. I was thinking, how do I even like tell this story? That is a very
No. It's
concise way of
appropriate.
putting it.
It is absolutely appropriate, and I enjoy the long form because it does give me the ability to throw the punchline of like how weird this actually is.
It
Right?
was
If you
super
hit
weird.
that
Yeah.
first, like it's an
Don't
interesting
forget the
thing.
cocktail cart.
Yeah, so that's most of these bottles were my version of a cocktail cart during the pandemic. It's like, hey, I'm not spending money on gas, I'm not spending money on lunch, I'm not going into the office anymore, I'm working here, so I just take all that extra money and start buying bottles to keep around, and then you start having to have an inventory sheet. The whole thing is very, very ridiculous, like
Yeah.
non-real problems. A
The
couple things.
inventory
So
sheet. It felt ridiculous when I made an inventory sheet, and that was when I had 50
it keeps you from
bottles.
accidentally buying the same bottle twice unless you meant to, right?
Yeah.
I did the first time I did that. I was like, oh sweet, I'm gonna buy this bottle. I've been wanting to think about it, but the thing about that was for a while. Come home, sit it right next to the other one. I was like, shh, whoop,
My bigger
maybe I should keep
motivation,
track.
I think, was to make sure that I didn't get the same sample again.
Hmm.
Because these days I have like a network of friends who
Yeah,
have different bottles than me. Thankfully, I like that we have a diversity. Yeah,
that's
you
what
got a
that.
whole shelf. Yeah, I've
That's
got.
one shelf. There's one over here, and there's some in the closet. Like I've got more than I can keep up with
I pulled
at this
down
point.
my drawers of American single malt samples. So we've
Yeah,
been talking about American single malt today.
yeah. So we are gonna eventually talk about American single
Yeah, and
malts.
that didn't
We
even
are.
show up on the star map yet because
Not
I
yet.
pretty
Well, I
much
mean,
just
it sort
covered
of did. It sort of
till
did. If we go back to the
2020.
beginning of the star map, right?
Yeah,
You start on beer.
yeah,
And what's the beginning of American single malt is beer,
yeah.
right? So
Single
what
malts
was
in
your beer?
general. Yeah,
Like what
yeah.
was your beer of choice? Like what style of beer was the thing?
Uh, I think the first beer. This sounds funny to me thinking back on it, but the first style of beer that I actually felt was like something special was a Hefeweizen.
Hmm.
In Austin, there was a bar I went to with friends regularly, and they had a Live Oak Hefeweizen, which was a relatively local beer. Something about that, I don't even really remember what it tastes like these days. But like I would imagine pretty normal for a Hefeweizen. I think it
Hmm.
tasted maybe sweeter than other Hefeweizens I've had since then. I guess I've kind of liked the sweeter side of beer. Um, Mostly besides that, the things that I liked most were stouts and porters. And, I wouldn't say that I was ever really a beer nerd, so I couldn't tell you really the difference technically between the two. But
Me either.
yeah.
Usually if I'm in a bar and it's not the summertime, and like I'm not buying whiskey, it's going to be what is the darkest, most bitter beer that you have. Like I want this beer to be like my soul, dark and bitter.
Or like my
And
coffee.
usually, if you're in the South, that one doesn't go over so well. People start getting real concerned about you, and you end up on somebody's prayer list. But if you're everywhere else, it's perfectly fine. So when I travel for work, and everybody else just sort of laughs, and they'll bring you something.
Oh, that's funny.
Um,
I heard jokes like that all the time in Texas. Maybe Texas is a little bit different from like the
Texas is a
rest
little
of
bit
the
different than
South.
everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I also
All
like
right.
coffee. But I think I
Yeah.
got into coffee kind of around the same time I got into whiskey, or maybe a little after, actually. I
See, and the
casually
thing is,
got
you
into
said
coffee.
you said earlier on, and I'm going to interrupt you. I'm the
Go
guy.
ahead.
I'm the guy that's going to interrupt you. You said earlier that your friends thought you were going to be the person who's going to get into like the finer things and the sort of like upper echelon of things. You've already talked about effectively craft beer, Japanese whiskey, Scotch, and fine coffee. Right? You're there. You and your viola. You're there.
Yeah, it
You're on
happened
that level.
eventually.
It
I
just didn't
think
happen with
what just
wine.
what just threw everybody off was it wasn't wine.
Right.
I still try wine every once in a while. It just never really like amazes me.
It's tough to. I feel like it's really great to find an acceptable wine, but I don't know that I can ever find one that I'm like, man, that was it. I need to find that bottle.
Yeah, that actually on that note, I think that has happened, but with
Mhm.
only like one wine. Um, there was I think they're closed now, which is a shame. There was a bar, not like an alcohol bar, I guess kind of an alcohol bar. There was a chocolate and wine bar in Seattle that I went to probably 3 or 4 times. And the bartender, chocolate specialist guy who was always there was like really great with names and faces. So like every time we went back, he knew us. And he remembered it was crazy. Like we wouldn't go there for a year and a half. We'd be back there. He remembered everything that we liked and didn't like. And even like what we were doing, like what we told him we were going to be up to in the next 6 months. Um, that sort of, if we're talking about like elevating a product in the industry, like that sort of salesmanship is what everyone should strive for, right? Like if you've got a customer who isn't sure what they want, but you remember them, you can
Mhm.
convince them to buy just about anything.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's exactly. I mean, I mean, it's not going to get me to buy a Mercedes Benz when I came in to buy a Pinto, but it is going to get me to buy a $30 pour of whiskey instead of a $10 pour of whiskey. Right?
yeah.
So I think there's a scalability problem there.
So the wine that I liked best there, paired with dark chocolate, was a Tempranillo, which I
Mhm.
had never heard of before. So usually when I see a Tempranillo, or I guess for other reasons like a Syrah, like there's a couple of wines that I at this point recognize by name and I know I'm gonna like that. Pinot Noir usually not my thing.
Mhm.
White
Yeah,
wines
and that's terrible because
almost
you're like
nothing.
right in the perfect zone for Pinot Noir, right?
Yeah, maybe I just haven't found the right one. I keep trying the like California, Washington, Oregon stuff, like the locals. I really
Hmm.
like shopping local. I think like local products, if you can get them, is the best way to go.
Hmm.
Um, which may actually be one of the reasons that American single malt stood out to me so hard. Um, and also, we're at least I'm drinking right now the Westward Pinot Noir cask.
Oh,
Um,
so I started with the wrong one. I started with the sourdough. Hold on.
well, I plan on having all three of them in a glass at the same time,
At the same time,
different
so
different
you're
glasses.
going for a blend here, is what you're saying.
No, no, not a blend. Three different glasses. Eventually, because I think it'll be cool to side by side. Um, Yeah, Westward is a really good American single malt. I think they've done a real good job of the storytelling and the branding and
Hmm.
getting the American single malt brand out there at a relatively affordable price. And they're always doing something interesting. Like I should we just go ahead and pivot right on into the quarterly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it's fair, right? So I'll kind of preface this with the, I have a significant interest in American single malt, and I think it's one of the places for the most significant growth in whiskey in North America, in the very near future. Simply because I think we're going to see a contraction in bourbon as people start spending money on other things. There's just a lot of opportunity for trying out ideas. Most folks that are making it are smaller holders. So the idea of being able to run an experimental batch of Pinot Noir is not the same as Heaven Hills of the world being like, all right, we got to shut down production on this, like 11,000 gallon tank to be able to run this experimental batch. So you get a lot of opportunity for that. But I think was it last year or the year before that they hit their bottle redesign?
The Westward?
Yes.
I couldn't tell you because I didn't really discover the brand uh until after the redesign. Every
So
bottle I'd seen except at the distillery, the first sourdough they did was in the old bottle.
mhm. Yeah, so
So
this is within the last couple of years. Maybe it
that
was
would have been
last year, maybe it was the year before. I don't know.
2020. So somewhere in
So
2020 is when they redesigned.
this is possibly one of the best bottle design glow ups that I think I have seen in the
Yeah,
last few years. Right, like
yeah. I
this
love having it behind me.
multifaceted gemstone
That's
looking
kind of yeah.
angular design is. I mean, it went from they had just a normal bottle
Yeah, I
to
think they call it the aspect bottle, like the cylinder with a half sphere and the little stubby neck.
yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that was Broken Barrel had the same thing. There's a bottle over here of Broken Barrel from a long time ago that had the same sort of design.
almost identical
Yep,
to this, and
perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with
it's
it. But
everything within reach, right?
yeah,
Virtually identical to this, which is a maple syrup bottle that I have whiskey in right now.
uh-huh.
Uh, Oh, green spot right over here, virtually
Hmm.
identical to this.
Yeah, it's it was a just perfectly fine design. There was nothing wrong with it, but they hit that bottle design, and it was, I mean, it just stands out on the shelf. It's beautiful. They are on the list of folks that I want to talk to in the next 12 months. Right, like these are the people that I'm reaching out to and saying, hey, I'd love to have you come and talk to me. You don't even have to send me anything. I already have the things. I just want to talk about it. But all of this to kind of frame out talking about American single malt, which has been a significant interest of yours for a while. So how did
Yeah.
we? How did you get to American single malt? So we've gotten to Scotch, and I think I can see that transition a lot easier because you're into Scotch, but you also like to buy local. So it's really hard to buy local Scotch in the United States. Very, very, very difficult.
Yeah, that's probably a part of it. I think that I didn't quite run out of my interest in. I've virtually never gotten to the end of my my shopping list for Scotch, right? There's always more that you want than your budget can support in a given month.
There's an end to the list.
I mean, there never has been, so I'll let you know if I ever get there.
You put one, you take one off, you put two on.
Yeah, it's sort of you try something, especially when you start getting into like weird stuff and you start like I got a Lecheg that's finished in a Rioja cask, and it looks like it's like a copper penny color. It's
Mm-hmm.
the coolest colored whiskey that I have, and it's no color added, right? It's all from the wine.
Yep.
Um, just like normally you've got that the whiskey magazine has the scale from 0 to 2, and they've got all these things, and they're all various shades of amber, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
You start getting into the sort of reddish mahogany stuff, but you never get like coppery tones. You never get sort of this pink unless you're in wine cask whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
And then the whiskey scale sort of falls apart at some point, and that's a perfect example. So you try something like that, and you go, "Oh, like that style of peat is cool. That style of wine cask is cool. Let me go try another Lecheg without the wine cask, and let me go find another Rioja cask." Right? That's the perfect example of I tried one thing and I wanted two more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how did I
I'm
go
waiting
from
to find the
Scotch
whiskey I
to
don't like. You know.
true? Yeah. Well, as a reviewer, there's a few things that we like less than others, at least I would say.
Right.
Um, I doubt that I'm ever gonna have any sort of a brand relationship with Johnny Walker, so I'm fine with saying White Walker was awful. It made my stomach hurt, even when it was
Mm-hmm.
frozen.
Yeah, that's what you. I was listening to you talk about it. I think you said you didn't feel like it really made your stomach hurt until it thawed out in your stomach.
Yeah, it was like at first it was like a cool like it's cold, it's like a cold
Mm.
cocktail, and then it was like it started warming up, and it was like, oh no, that's not right.
And they almost got me. It's branding at that point, right? Because now they're combining a whole other thing that I feel super nerdy and excited about. Because I started reading the Martin novels years and years ago, and then we hit the White Walker, and then the Scotch series that was all the different houses of Game of Thrones, and I was like, there's nothing specifically unique about these bottles. There's nothing specific aside from the branding, but I still really wanted all of them. But then I heard the reviews come out on White Walker, and I was like, all right, I feel good about not making that purchase.
All right, I'm in the background thinking, how exactly did I end up in American Single Malt? I
Yep.
think there's more to tell on the Scotch story first.
Okay.
So I started reviewing Scotch. Um, I wanted to swap samples, and I found out through various means that there were people local to me who were doing that. Um, and that the least gray area way of doing that was to actually make friends and meet up before we decided to swap samples. So basically did that. One of those people worked at the same company I did at the time. They felt like, I was a perfectly reasonable human being. They introduced me to their other friends. So we have sort of a quarterly meetup group where we do a theme. We bring usually Scotch, to some extent all whiskey, to some extent spirits beyond whiskey, and sometimes we'll do a theme where it's like, guys, just stop, don't bring anything that's single malt. We need to try other things. But yeah, sort of mostly Scotch, and we sort of branched out from there. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the very first one of those meetups I went to, one of the people I had never met before, online or otherwise, because he's sort of like he's not online all that much, but he's
Hmm.
part of the group. Um, Brought with him. I did take it out. The behind me, this blue label, the Lost Lantern American
Yep.
Vatted Malt, edition number one. Um, and I just loved that. And immediately next to it on the table, one of the other people in the group is a big fan of specifically I, American single malt in general. A lot of the samples I have of American single malt are from him, um, but especially Balcones single malt. And Balcones was from my home state of Texas. I lived there from when I was 9 until end of college, so like most of my youth, I guess, in Texas. I consider it my home state. So, Balcones being from my home state, I knew of them. I didn't know they made a single malt. I wouldn't have known what that meant 2 years prior
Hmm.
because Scotch was Scotch until I figured out that like Japanese single malt and Scotch single malt have this single malt thing in common,
Hmm.
which is sort of a great background for a future part of this conversation, I think. So basically, that vatted malt and the Balcones next to it sort of both made a great impression on me and made me want more of whatever that was. So I looked at the back label of that. I could be rude and stand up, face my back, which I do on my own podcast all the time. But you know, um, so on the back here, they're like, okay, Balcones Distilling in Waco, Texas, Copperworks Distilling in Seattle, Washington. Wait, you mean they're local? I can get that here,
Hmm.
right? Santa Fe Spirits, Triple Eight Distillery. I actually have not had that yet. Virginia Distillery Company and Westward Whiskey down in Portland, and I go to Portland once a year for athletic stuff. So I was like, oh, I can, right? This stuff, it's not only just like it's not from Kentucky or it's not just from Texas. It's like it's all over, and they've got Pacific Northwest stuff there. So that sort of like opened me up to like, oh, there's like this is a thing that I like and I can buy it local. I can get it here. So I sort of started going into that. I found out that Westland isn't even in that bottle, but Westland is a big brand around here. I found out that a local bar called the Barrel Thief, great bar, want to give them a shout out. Sort of Scotch whiskey, everything whiskey bar. Um, they had I forget what they called it, some sort of tasting club where they would run events. So they would have I did the Judgment of Westward. I did the Judgment of Westland there, for example. But they also had like Zoom events. So Single Cast Nation did a Zoom event where they like distributed I think 5 or 6 samples of different things and then had a Zoom later. Um, One of the ones was Westland did a preview tasting of Calare Edition 1.
Hmm.
And at the time, I didn't understand the significance of that, because I didn't really know Westland before that. And I didn't know the significance of a varietal of barley. But that was like, that was what they were trying to do. And they totally sold me on the significance of it in that tasting. Like, here, try I have the samples here actually still. Like this is the sort of thing like finish your open samples, but like I keep these because referring back to them is really cool, and like you're always gonna be able to try more of the flagship Westland. Um, and The Calari first edition, like I have a very different opinion of it every year I come back and try another half ounce of this. The first time it
Hmm.
was like, oh, this is the most amazing thing that I've ever had in whiskey. That was my genuine opinion of this, almost enough to get me to buy it, except it cost $183 out the door. And I sort
Hmm.
of went, that's not quite in the budget. I
Right.
wasn't ready for that much of a plunge because this was back in the time where my most expensive bottle was Maker's Mark,
Right.
right?
That
Or
that was the prime stuff. That was the prime stuff.
so like making that or arguably the Yamazaki, right?
Hmm.
Because it become worth more. Um, yeah, this is like super like grilled pineapple. And it's got like this sort of ashiness to it, which I've come to describe as the Westland barrel char note because
Hmm.
almost all of them have it. It's actually how I was dead sure that the whatever sample in the Judgment of Westland was the Westland is because no other whiskey does that in my mouth. Like it doesn't have like that texture is so unique. Um, which that just comes from critically tasting things and going back a whole bunch of times. But yeah, this the Caleri was like they were saying this is a significant whiskey. I think was the refrain, um, that this is the first, American whiskey where we've cultivated a single cultivar of barley, the Alba barley, specifically for flavor generation, even at the cost of yield. Right? It's not
Hmm.
efficient, but we think it'll taste good, and let's develop that. I thought that was the coolest thing.
I mean,
Um,
it is the coolest thing, right? Like they're
yeah.
and because that's a thing that other people are chasing now. You know, you've got um, Mammoth in Michigan is propagating their own rye varietal on an island off the west coast of Michigan to try to keep it from picking up cross pollination because rye is notoriously promiscuous. Everybody's chasing down, and I was listening to a podcast with Alan Bishop from Spirits of French Lick, and he was talking about like every distillery should have their own grain, like through land race gardening or through selective breeding or whatever. You can find something that is both relatively okay for yield, but also regionally specific because terroir is a thing, whether people want to argue about it or not. It is a thing in whiskey, and it may be not the same as much as the soil plays the role in wine that soil would play a role in whiskey, but the grain absolutely does. The aging absolutely does. The sourcing of the barrel wood absolutely does. The yeast, all of these things really, really do. And so you have this ability. So everyone should be, right? But this is a thing that you see, or at least I've seen in American single malt, is a lot of these ideas are not new to them. They're just new to everybody else.
Yeah. I think beer figured it out a long time ago because you can't hide your grain. You can't hide your yeast.
Yep.
Uh, Wine, obviously, anything that grows for a long time is going to pick up the properties of where it is. I think that's why there's not debate that terroir is the thing in wine.
Mm-hmm.
There's to the extent that there's debate that there's terroir in whiskey, I think it is mostly down to the still eliminates so much nuance depending on your still type, and we'll get into
Yeah.
that.
Because if you're doing a pot, then
Yeah.
the
But
game's
if
off a little
you're
bit.
if you're thinking from the context of bourbon, where almost everything is column still,
Yeah.
and
No, there's not going to be. I mean, you've
yeah,
ripped it out.
yeast is an ingredient that generates alcohol, not flavor, is the
Right.
thinking for the most part with the column stills. And then with some of the brands like Jack Daniels, you're going even further to say once it comes off the still, let's put it through as much charcoal as it can handle until it tastes like nothing before it goes into the barrel.
Mm-hmm.
It tastes like nothing but smooth, which isn't a flavor. Um, and then it picks up the barrel flavors, and barrel is what it tastes like. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that there's I don't I don't want to state my opinions as if they're facts. So just if I say
I mean,
something
they're
that
facts
sounds
to you. Like
factual, I think right.
I think anybody who I will go ahead and say this. Anybody who shows up here who doesn't understand that we're all really talking about just how we feel and that this is subjective, just get the fuck out of here. Like that's where,
Yeah.
like
When it comes to how things taste and how I think things should be made, it's all opinions. Uh,
absolutely.
I think that it's a shame to sort of hide so many of your ingredient inputs to whiskey behind a column still. I think the
Mm-hmm.
result is, I had the Wild Turkey and I had the Maker's Mark, and I've tried a bunch of other bourbons since then, and I bought, because it's so accessible. Bourbon is so accessible. You go on
Mm-hmm.
a whiskey shopping spree, and I saw your spreadsheet of bourbon, which I thought was your entire thing at first until I realized there were other tabs.
Yeah, you
You're
got to
you
keep
have
the bourbon separate from everybody else.
you have as much bourbon as I think my entire collection, um, pretty much. Uh, so for me, I got to about probably the 30th bottle of bourbon, and I sort of stopped opening. Right, I opened like 20 of them, and I sort of stopped opening them. Right, it was like there was a little bit of a collector's
Mm-hmm.
anxiety thing that sort of goes into like I gotta have this cool thing because it said it's finished in this type of barrel, and I think that's cool. I may never open it because I've got so much other bourbon that I basically think bourbon tastes more or less the same. Like
Mm-hmm.
bourbon occupies a very narrow band of flavors in my mind. And a lot of people that I've learned Scotch things from feel the same way. So take that with a grain of salt. But,
Yep.
you could pretty much close your eyes and throw darts at a board, and it tastes like cinnamon, caramel, um,
Vanilla.
Vanilla, yeah, char, like oak char, oak. You can't even like everyone. I've once, I think, actually felt that oak was the appropriate flavor note
Hmm.
because oakiness is a whole tasting profile thing that I think people have gotten carried away with. It tastes oaky, like it tastes like things that oak did to whiskey,
Hmm.
especially new charred oak, which is kind of a very specific thing, right? You just the barrel, right? Bourbon is so constrained up until you get to the point where it's resting in a barrel and you're just waiting, and it's like it's climate and maybe entry proof and time. Uh, it's not surprising to me that I feel that that produces a very narrow range of flavors out the other end,
Hmm.
right? Beer to me, more flavor diversity than bourbon. I think beer drinkers would probably agree with that. Um, I wanted a whiskey that if I'm going to be buying bottle after bottle and trying different things, I wanted a type of whiskey that would give me that diversity. And I felt single malt was the thing that was doing that for me. The Japanese
Hmm.
single malt, the Scotch single malt, and the American single malt. When I discovered that, I said, and it's based on a few examples. Um, if I could get philosophical on you for a moment,
Go for it.
um, you ever think about how much of your own city you haven't seen?
See, this is a bad question for me, right? Because you live in and I would assume I don't know exactly where you live, but I got a roundabout area. You live closer to a metropolitan area than I do by far. I live in a
Sure.
very small town in western Kentucky where I grew up.
So you've
There's
probably seen
not
all
much
of
of
your
the
small
city that
town
I
there.
have not
Yeah,
seen.
fair. But say you go to Louisville,
Right.
right? How much of Louisville are you ever going to see, even if you visit every distillery that's there or every good restaurant that's there?
Over the course of 43 years, I've probably covered 13, maybe 14% of Louisville. And that's
Yeah,
a
I think that's a
4-ish hour
fairly
drive from me. So,
fairly typical
yep.
answer, I think. Um, for me, I think it probably would have been like less than that, maybe 5-10%
Hmm.
until I got a dog. And then you start going like, oh, like there's these little pocket parks I could go visit. And you end up like seeing these little neighborhoods and everything. You go, I could every weekend of my life, I could find a brand new place I've never seen before. It may not be as good as the last place, but it's new at
Yep.
least, right? Um, so with that philosophical backdrop in mind, um, it's entirely possible that there's a whole bunch of scotch, back up 2 years and say like I've experienced a handful of scotches, a handful of bourbons, and like three or four American single malts. It's entirely possible that at that point in time that these categories have a massive overlap. So what did I do? More research. I bought more
Hmm.
scotch. I bought more American single malt. I found that like scotch is great. I love scotch, right? They're well established. There's a whole bunch of tradition. You pretty much know what you're going to get. The smoky Isla scotches really do it for me. The sort of mainland scotches can be hit or miss. I like things that have a really balanced complexity to them, like
Hmm.
a mix of sweetness and bitterness and like tartness and meatiness and sort of a fatty oiliness, right? The mouth feels important to me. Not everything has that. I think especially the big market brands are aiming for smooth,
Hmm.
and especially there's hot takes around chill filtering. I think chill filtering does make a difference to the mouthfeel, if nothing else. Arguably, probably flavor as well. I think that fat soluble flavor compounds and fatty flavors are a significant thing that I like. As someone who I think I got into tasting like via being a foodie before I really got into alcohol. Like, going to I guess my before all this alcohol stuff, my outlet for the finer things was fancy restaurants. I like sushi and a nice steak and a French restaurant now and again. Um, I don't know if I could like off the top of my head name any good restaurants, but that's not really the point of the conversation, right? I think that as far as whiskey is concerned, people are underrating how much those not soluble at cold temperature molecules are doing to the flavor. I don't really understand how you can argue that makes no difference. But you know, it's hard to know because
Hmm.
it's notoriously difficult to find a side by side of something that is exactly the same, like all else equal. One's chill filtered and one isn't, and
Right.
to see what the difference is between that. Basically, unless you work at a distillery, you might, from an academic perspective, do that experiment. and then make the call about whether you value that difference, or whether it's better for the brand to go one way or another on that. I think economics dictates that more often than flavor. So if you can market non-chill filtered, which you almost never notice in American whiskey. Like, who says non-chill filter? It's becoming more common, but
It's
like,
it's on labels, but it's not a marketing term. It's not a term that anybody's paying attention to. And you know, like there are terms that people have traditionally paid attention to in bourbon that are also going away. You know, like blended bourbon 15, 20 years ago was a naughty word, and now you've got folks that are taking different distillate from different states and blending it together to create something unique, like, you know, Barrel or uh, Penelope, or any of these folks that are like blending what you might consider to be similar to independent bottlers or whatever else, right? They're not just sourcing just a single distillery, they're creating kind of a new thing, right? So chill filtered exists on some bottles, but nobody's paying attention to it. And to your point, I think you're right. I think that, I mean, for a process that is very, very highly regimented and highly controlled and highly paid attention to, because everything could have a flavor impact, to say this entire process has no flavor, then why are you doing it? Like, if it has no impact aside from maybe making it clearer or prettier or whatever, I don't like it. You're not going to take the
yeah,
risk, and
I
I
think
don't
they
know.
end up saying, uh, it looks like a flaw when you put your whiskey on ice and it gets cloudy. Therefore, we want to fix the flaw, and we're going to argue that it makes no difference
Can
besides
I
the
tell if my
appearance.
whiskey is cloudy if I put it in a glass and I put it with ice, and the glass starts to condensate because it's now getting colder than the room is, right? Like, can you really tell it's cloudy? Like, is this a real thing?
I don't know that I've ever noticed that. Uh, I think if you chill a bottle of whiskey and it's like, yeah, your frozen bottle of Wild Turkey is going to be frosty when it comes out of the
Mhm.
freezer, so you're just never going to see it. Um,
And I think I don't remember
Wild
who.
Turkey, I think, is chill filtered anyway, but
I think, and I could be wrong. I think I've heard this, is that basically anything that's sitting above like 95 or 96 proof, it doesn't really matter anyways. For clarity's sake, if you're going to ice it down, it only really impacts at lower proofs. Which
yeah,
maybe that makes a difference. That makes a difference in the Scotch realm, because there is a lot lower proof, a lot more offerings in the lower proof range. You know, lower proof for a bourbon person is anything below 95. You know.
yeah. I guess I want to be thoughtful about how I phrase this, because for me, almost everything is a neat sipper. Almost everything.
Yep.
Bourbon, I would say 50-50. I intend to use in cocktails, at
Mm-hmm.
least to the degree of like an old fashioned or a Manhattan, like as few ingredients as I can put in it. If I want to taste the whiskey, and there's really not a whole lot of cocktails I want to make where I won't taste the spirits, because the spirits for me are the more complex, the more artful. The
Mm-hmm.
like, even when I'm having a cocktail, I want to know, I want to experience the personality of the spirit that went into it, and even down to the nuances of one brand is different from another. Um, so that's me, but the market at large is going to be putting things in cocktails. At which point, unless it's a boozy, clear cocktail like a Manhattan, you're not going to notice.
No.
And I don't think, like you said, the glass is going to be sweating and whatever. I don't think you're going to notice it be a little cloudy. Um, an old fashioned, there's so much going on in there. You've got the sugar and the bitters and the orange. Like, if anybody even notices there's a cloudiness to it, their first thought isn't going to be, oh, the whiskey was flawed.
I mean, I don't know that I've ever paid attention to the clarity of anything that I have drank aside from a glass of water. Right, like I'm gonna pay attention to
Yeah.
that one. I'm not looking for floaters in it, but if it's got any color to it, like, is it that the glass wasn't like, there's so many things that kind of come into play of that. And
Yeah.
it has it has to have some sort of an impact. Back to the original point of, like,
Yeah.
you know, chill filtering has some degree of impact.
Yeah, probably does. And this is more to say, like, there's, everything with the column still and the chill filtering and everything. It's like we're doing the best we can to take flavors away for
Mm-hmm.
the benefit of homogenizing what was maybe a flawed product through the through the effort. you end up needing to make compromises to take a product that is maybe more unpredictable. I shouldn't say flawed, but maybe more unpredictable.
I think you're right. So, and this is where you and I will depart in our thought processes. Largely, most of bourbon up until the last 10-ish years in my mind is all about repeatability. Like they want the same thing over and over again. And so to have repeatability, you have to eliminate any variables that are going to change that thing, right? And so they really are trying to, if we think about anywhere between, 1965 and 2010, 2007, we'll just say 2007, right? They're largely just trying to find a way for someone to buy their product because no one cared about bourbon at that point in time. Like your Wellers and Pappies of the world were sitting on the shelf every single day for retail prices for a long time. And I distinctly remember this because I sort of started getting back into whiskey in 2007-ish, right? And by 2010, your Weller 12, which was on the shelf for $25, $22, was now going for $60 in secondary markets. That was the first time it was starting to pop up, is in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And I was like,
These
there's no
numbers
way
are
I'm
so
not going to do
tiny. It breaks your
it.
heart.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm never going to do it. And I think about it now, like, because I was, I was 27, 28. If I had to take every dollar I had and bought every single one of those bottles and held on to them, I could retire now, right? Like I absolutely could retire because of what happened. But most of bourbon built in this idea of let's be as inoffensive as possible. Let's be as passable in a cocktail. Let's be the thing. Makers was still marketing to the grandpa or the dad who's sitting at home on the couch drinking. They literally marketed towards a gentleman's whiskey. Like that's what they were really, really after. But Jim Beam, Jack Daniels,
Looks
Jack
good on a
Daniels'
shelf
bourbon.
though. I've got my bottle of Maker's
Yeah, no,
46
it's
back
a
there.
beautiful bottle and it always has been. But they were really good about marketing it, but they weren't largely doing anything that was going to be incredibly offensive. And I think you see, or at least I saw, you start to see in the late, 2000 to the early 2010s is when you start seeing some unique things start to happen with Jim Beam, with Maker's Mark, with all of the premier players, which also kind of aligns to other things. Now they're starting to rethink what they were doing. They're making rice whiskeys. They're starting to finish in different types of oaks. They're exploring a place, and what it is things like American single malt came into a realm of being able to explore and do whatever the hell they wanted to, but bourbon was still trying to recover and still sort of looking back towards this time when people wanted clear liquors to put in cocktails for 30 years and they almost went broke. And the only reason they didn't go broke was because Japan and England were still buying bourbon by the bucket loads because they appreciated whiskey. So they're always looking back that direction and they're less likely to do it. That's why you will see there are a lot of bourbons here, but there's also a lot of craft bourbons because I think that's in a similar vein. Those folks are doing some of the experimentation that American single malt is doing because that's largely craft distillers as well. But now we're starting to see premier players step into American single malts as well. You've got Jim Beam is in the game, and Luxco with Yellowstone. Like you got all these people that are now starting to make American single malts because they see it. Do you think, and there's a hard transition at this point, do you think that they're starting to play in this realm because there is some degree of standardization that's happening within the definition of American single malt?
When you say they,
The larger distilleries, the
okay. Yeah,
Jim Beams of the world, the Maker's Marks of the world, and I say Maker's Mark because they have not done an American single malt, but they are just released a label this week for 100% wheat whiskey.
Nice.
Maybe not 100%. I can't remember. Anyways, but it's a wheat
feels
whiskey.
on brand because they're all about their red wheat component of the mash bill.
It's on brand, but it's not because they have not changed a mash bill ever.
That's true. And
it's always been the same.
Somebody was saying on your podcast a while back that they were probably closer to how they were 30 years ago than almost any other bourbon.
Absolutely. Aside from the Maker's 46 experiment, which is just about French oak, that's all that's really about. The mash bill hasn't changed. The yeast strain possibly has changed. And, depending upon how they distill, whether that has an impact or not, most commercial yeast strains are, like you said, are for yield. But if you look at some of the craft distillers that are capturing their own yeast, they're finding localized yeast strains that do have an same to what Westward is doing. They have this sourdough blend here, right? Like there's a
Yep.
local yeast strain that is going to have an impact on flavor. Maybe great, maybe not so great. Leopold Brothers out in Colorado is doing the exact same thing. They have open fermentation tanks that allows for wild yeast to occur. All of these things, but do you think the attraction? Do you think there is an attraction for the beams of the world to participate in American single malt because they're standardization, and so they feel like it's an even playing field, or do you think it's just like there is a growing market and they're going to get into it, or some mix of both?
I think. Oh, there's a lot to say on this topic.
Okay.
Sometime around, I don't know, early 2021. I already had found out about the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission.
Mhm.
Um, that's kind of a story in itself. I think there was a part 4 to how I got into American Single Malt, which is via the Whiskey Lodge, which
Mhm.
I should do my part to shout out. Right, the Whiskey Lodge is the branding that I'm using for my podcast right now, which is the Whiskey Lodge Cast. It's not a podcast; it's more of a webcast because we're only doing Twitch and YouTube at the moment.
Mhm.
Um, this is I got permission from the owner of the Whiskey Lodge to use that branding as an admin of the Whiskey Lodge to sort of put our philosophy out into the world. Uh, at the Whiskey Lodge, which you should all go check out. There's going to be a link in the description to an invite to the channel, to the server. I'm not very good at social media. Sorry if I use the wrong terms. Um,
No, you're fine. See. This is the thing. Like I do this podcast as just a fun thing that I enjoy, but I am terrible about the social media portion of it and the advertising and the trying to grow your following. If people come and they want to listen, this is great. If not, that's fine too. I'm not trying to make anything off this, so I get it. I am absolutely terrible at it as well.
so the Whiskey Lodge, as it turns out, this is related to the other point. There are some producers of whiskey in the Whiskey Lodge. There's certain forward-thinking individuals and I think less brands, and I almost hope that it stays that way. That brands aren't really trying to use this as a marketing venue, but the individuals who love their craft love to hang out with whiskey nerds. And when you're in a whiskey nerd communities, every once in a while, you get a nerdy distiller shows up and wants to talk about their stuff, but they also just want to talk about whiskey. And so,
Hmm.
in the Whiskey Lodge, the first producer that I met there was Joe O'Sullivan from Clear Creek, the maker of um, McCarthy's single malt, McCarthy's Oregon single malt. Which one you got there?
6 year, 100% heavily peated Scottish barrel
Okay. Wait, I don't know if I know that one. Is that a single cask release?
batch MC6, possibly, yeah. MC6 2101.
Oh, okay. No, yeah, I have that one. I'd
It
have to
was
go
a
grab it out
sample
of the
sent
can.
from a friend.
Yeah, it's a heavily peated 6 year old. That's their standard McCarthy's. That's their standard 6 year release. The first one that they
Mhm.
did. Um, I McCarthy's is my absolute favorite whiskey in the world. I felt awkward saying that at first, but the more things I try, the more like if I ever don't know what I want to drink, or if I'm having an unsure palate kind of night, I will grab a McCarthy's. I'm always happy, and it's always great. It's always
Mhm.
consistently 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 for me. Um, it's just somehow a perfect match for my palate. Even before I became familiar with it, when I had COVID and lost my sense of smell, the first thing that I could identify at all, and I identified it blind, was a sample of McCarthy's I had never tried before.
Mhm.
So, and that particular sample will stand out in my head forever as the thing that got me over COVID. So, some people theorize that you need something that is particularly pungent and memorable
Yep.
to sort of kickstart your palate again after you've had COVID. I think the fact that I went from smelling like almost nothing in the floral direction to having almost a full sense of smell basically overnight, I attribute that to the McCarthy's. It's how much I love it. I have almost I would say almost every standard release since I found them, and a bunch of single barrels and some samples too. Um, I'm actually looking into doing a barrel pick with them for the Whiskey Lodge. If we
Nice.
can get enough interest in that, I'm actually hopefully the plans work out. I'm meeting with Caitlin Bartlemay this Friday to at the distillery to see what they, what might be what might work, right?
Hmm.
There's an economics angle as well as like,
Yeah.
does it match my tastes? I have no doubt that it will because I love everything that they've done. Um, is there interest in it is the next factor for choosing a barrel. This is going to be
Hmm.
my first one, so like I'm probably overthinking this. Um,
No, I think so. This is the caution because I have another friend who is going through the beginning of doing barrel picks. Right, it's David from Whiskey My Wedding Ring, and he and I have talked about it quite a bit, and actually sat in on one of his picks. And you want that first one to be a sell through relatively quick, right? Because you don't want it to scare you away from doing another one later on, right? And if it takes
mm,
you 6 months to sell a barrel, how gun shy are you going to be able to do it next, right? And so you want to make sure the economics are right. You want to make sure the interest is right. Then you got to know, like, is your audience big enough to support how many barrels per year, right? If you want to do multiple barrel picks in a year, um, everybody's got a whiskey. Most everybody has a budget for their whiskey, right?
mm-hmm,
Some people just buy, but most everybody has a budget. So you got to feel those things out, and that's not an easy thing to sort of discover.
absolutely. So yeah, that back onto the story. So that discovering McCarthy's was sort of like I think the fourth thing that happened. Where so I had had the Balcones and the vatted malt and the Westland Colere tasting, and then I met Joe, and he was uh like honestly what sold me on McCarthy's initially was Joe showed up in a voice chat on Discord, and we sort of do a round table and ask everybody what they're drinking, and Joe's like, I'm drinking McCarthy's, and I'm like, wait, don't you make McCarthy's? He was like, yeah, I just felt like drinking it.
Right.
Right. Oh, also it's free. Like he was just so genuine.
Yeah.
I don't think it's actually free. I think that was just a joke, but um
I mean,
he
look. I
was
mean,
just so
if you're
genuine
making it, you
about
got to pull out
wanting.
the samples every so often. And I've talked to several producers. They end up with, we think we've got a lot of sample bottles. They're
Yeah,
having to
yeah,
pull
oh yeah.
samples to test barrels, and they're
Uh-huh.
not drinking them all every time. So then
Yeah.
what
I
happens?
saw Balcones's blending room,
Yeah.
and they had enough volume of samples out to be my entire collection of whiskey.
Yeah.
And that's just like what they were going through that day. And not surprising
Hmm.
because the barrel house is enormous too, right? They've got more barrels than more floors than I saw and more barrels than I could put eyes on the one floor that I walked through. So, um, yeah, that's a whole thing. So, Joe was super genuine about like just his passion for his own product. And he wasn't like pushing it either. It was like when
Hmm.
he was done with that glass, he poured something else, and like the whole conversation moved on. We played Jackbox games. Jackbox is like if you don't know, it's like these games where you can put up on like a stream or a TV or something. It's like a trivia game
Hmm.
or other sorts of stuff like that, and then like you can use your phone to play. So it works really well as a Discord hangout. Um, so we do games like that and stuff. And we were just like the conversation just went on, and like at some point in the conversation, I decided like, hey, we've got this guy here who's a really cool dude. We like hanging out with him. He makes whiskey. I should try that whiskey. Like he makes peated Scotch style whiskey. I like that. I might as well go
Hmm.
try it. So I went and bought a bottle, which happened to be a single barrel. It was my instant like almost near favorite whiskey on the very first try.
Hmm.
And then I decided that I wanted to try another thing, and that was a hit too. So I was like, okay, I just got to have everything that they make. So that, that sort of that path through American single malt, and then discovering my favorite brand of whiskey, having had dozens, perhaps hundreds of brands of tries under my belt at that point, uh,
Did,
just
did
made
you
me
know
want
that that
to.
was like the OG of American single malts at that point? Like
I didn't.
that is sort of the genesis of it all.
Yeah, I didn't. I didn't know until I started doing research about American single malt.
Hmm.
I I
You start
feel
doing the
like
research and you come across the name. You're like, I know that one. I know
funny
that
enough,
one.
I think most of the whiskey podcasts that I listened to were because I was looking for interviews with. I started by looking for interviews with Joe and Caitlin,
Hmm.
anybody from Clear Creek. Um, I think and from there I sort of like brands that got talked about. Like I think One Nation Under Whiskey did an interview with Copperworks. I was like, oh, Copperworks sounds really cool. They've got like a 7-day fermentation, and they do
Hmm.
everything in small batches of barrels, and they've got a specific theme that they're aiming for and all this stuff. That's really cool. There's like a lot of artistry that goes into a brand like that. I want to know more about them. I want to try them. There's so many brands that are like that now. I think a lot of American single malt is the craft whiskey that is I think is like the predominantly how do I say this? American single malt is predominantly craft whiskey.
Yes.
So it almost feels like it is the craft spirit of the United States at this moment.
I think that you make a like the true spirit of the United States is probably corn whiskey is what it should be, but the first true one was rye. But if we look at like what actually matches the way the country is set up is American single malt would be it at this point, right? And it goes back to I've got a question on some standards because you have a whole lot of thoughts on the standards that were proposed. I've got a couple questions that I do want to talk about on
Yeah.
those. We'll get there eventually. I'm not in any kind of rush. But I think American single malt has the diversity to represent. Like if you were to pick up an American single malt or say a vatted four malt from, sorry, a quad malt from Frey Ranch in Colorado, or if you pick up American single malt from Kentucky or Texas or Oregon, they're all going to be different. And that's what makes them the most American, I think, spirit that exists. Whereas if you get the same bourbon, and they're going to be nuanced differences, but they're largely going to be homogenized, you know, because
Yeah.
the primary flavors of bourbon are flavors that don't allow for nuance to kind of come through.
I'll accept that. I don't want to get into a whole debate about bourbon because I think I have less mature opinions than you do, and I'm not sure I
No,
entirely
I
agree
mean,
with all of that.
I mean, there's, I don't know that we diverge on that. I think bourbon is very much a brash flavor profile that it's hard for anything else to come out of than vanilla. The only way you get there is with um, unique wood finishes or unique cask finishes, or you find craft distillers that are pot distilling, capturing their own wild yeast. You know, there's got to be something they're doing, but most of
Yeah.
the bourbon you buy off the shelf is going to be commodity bourbon. It's going to taste largely the same. There is a very slight difference in the flavor profiles, and you don't really know if that's because there's a slight difference or just because you want there to be a slight difference because your brain can tell you a lot of things that maybe not be so true.
I feel like there was a couple of points of clarification on earlier things, just to
Okay.
completely pivot from the bourbon
No, do
conversation
it.
real quick. Then we can come back to that question that you asked. That was a hard pivot about the big brands getting their space in American single malt because I think that is a really interesting topic. Um, I was saying that I don't really understand wine. I haven't found a wine that like really tickles me yet. But there was one example. On my honeymoon, we went to a French cafe for brunch, and they served a sauterne as I guess it was the recommendation for the dish that we had ordered.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely loved that. So dessert wine is a category of wine that I actually do really get into, which I think overlaps with the fortified wines that are used so commonly in whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
That wine made me want to care about wine and made me want to care about wine and whiskey. I've actually gone and found not a sauterne, but a different um, same grape, I guess, a different expression. I ended up finding a bottle sitting like dusty on a shelf in a Total Wine in a different town.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the first bottle of wine I'd ever gone hunting for because it was based on the specs. I sort of wanted to recapture that honeymoon thing. And it also bears mentioning, and one of these whiskeys, one of these Westwards that we have to taste today, is a Sauterne. So there's a little bit of overlap there as well. Yeah, I've got.
As
This is
soon
the
as you
really
mentioned
light
it, I went
colored
ahead
one.
and started. I have my glasses set. I have these little plastic discs that I leave over top of them, so that way it keeps the smell down a little bit.
Yeah, I sort of rotated my glasses at some point and lost track of which one is which, and I
See,
don't
that's
really
why I
want to
do the
play the game
plastic
of
ones because then I
identify.
can write you, but you can't read it. But
Yeah,
that's a dry
no,
erase marker
yes,
written on top.
I use watch glasses. They're glass though, and I
Yeah.
just forgot today, and so I
See,
rotated them.
I have the glass ones, but I am notorious for knocking these things off, and the glass doesn't go super well, like the
So
glass top.
it looks like the sourdough is actually the lightest of the three
Mm-hmm.
in the bottle, anyway, which I think means that the one I have in the stemmed glass is the sourdough one.
That matches for me, provided we have the exact same Pinot cask. But one would imagine that
Oh
the
yeah, I think
sourdough
that
is
the
going to be
Pinot
lighter
cask
than
is
the
always
Pinot.
pretty dark.
Yeah.
I don't think you even need the exact same Pinot cask for that. And the other thing is that on my podcast, one of my co-hosts is I guess he doesn't call himself a sommelier, but he worked in wine before he got into the whiskey industry. He works at Del Bach now. But I really want to pick his brain on the the sort of the wine angle on both wine and whiskey, right? I think that's definitely coming. Look out for that on our podcast stream.
There's a lot of people that make that transition from wine to whiskey or vice versa. But that's the guy, and I can't remember his name, but he's the one that wears the different hats.
Yeah.
Like he always has like a different hat on it on every stream, right?
Yep.
Like I thoroughly enjoy the confidence of a man who will just wear a hat. Period. Right.
I don't know if
Like,
I know what his hair looks like.
I have sort of a misshapen large head, and I always feel hats look ridiculous. But like every time I see a guy with a hat, I'm like, yeah, that's not like a baseball hat. Baseball hats don't count. But like unique hats, I'm like, that's it. That is yes, good job.
I think baseball caps are pretty much the limit for me, and I wear them to keep the light and water out of my eyes when I'm paddling. So they're more of a practical purpose and not a fashion sense thing. I tried wearing a fedora. I think everybody realizes that's a mistake. Not a whole lot of people can pull off a fedora.
I looked at one online one time, and that's as far as I got before I was like, no, this is not it. But you may not. I know your knowledge on bourbon is more limited than anything else, but the guy that owns Smoke Wagon, named Aaron, he's always wearing a cowboy hat that has this big like turquoise buckle thing on the front of it. I'm envious of that. Like I can't pull off a hat. It's just not a thing. He hopped on I had him on an episode. I'm like, man. He's like, just wear the hat. Who cares? I'm like, I don't feel comfortable in it.
I think that's the thing. If you feel comfortable with what you're wearing, then like nobody's gonna feel like it doesn't work. But if you don't feel comfortable, then you don't feel comfortable, and that's all there is to it.
So, anyways, huge divergence.
Okay, let's talk about big brands and American single malt.
Yep.
Obviously, the most notable example is the Jack Daniel's. Pretty soon after. So, just for some background, I assume that people haven't gone and read my article or writings about the TTB's proposal. In July last year, the TTB proposed the definition for American single malt whiskey, which is pretty much everything that the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission wanted. And I think, if anything, it lacked nuance that whiskey nerds expect, because it sort of lumped a few things together that maybe, or it didn't draw distinctions that we wish were drawn. But it did give everything, in a broad sense, it gave everything that the commission asked for. Another cool thing about the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, by the way, is that you can see a list of who is making American single malt in alignment with those principles. So there's 200 plus distilleries that are making American single malt the way that the commission proposed, and there are probably more who just haven't signed up for the list.
Right.
I didn't see it on the website, but I think I heard through the grapevine. Wild Turkey was actually on the list of companies that signed up in alignment with the commission. And my working theory on that is either Wild Turkey already put single malt into a barrel as an experiment, or planned to do so, or they just wanted to keep the finger on the pulse of like the regulatory workings.
I don't know how they don't, right? Because it feels like every major player is exploring American single malt, right? Whether it be a few barrels hidden in a rick house somewhere, or a full-on product release like the Claremont Steep, which is just a terrible name altogether. Like Steep, like whatever.
It's not hard to imagine that any bourbon maker would have the ability to make a single malt, because all bourbon has malted barley in it. It's something they're already doing. So it's actually not that big of a step. And Jack Daniel's being like the first, pretty much as soon as that July 2022 proposal came out, like within months, Jack Daniel's had released their triple mash, or at least had announced their triple mash, which was going to contain bonded whiskey, a blend of bonded whiskey from 3 different styles, which was the bourbon, or the Tennessee whiskey, the rye, and the American single malt.
Jack Daniel's is bourbon. It's okay. You can say it here.
I certainly, I think that if you read the regulations, you'll find that everything Jack Daniel's does fits perfectly into the definition of bourbon.
There is nothing that legally precludes them from calling themselves a bourbon. They just choose not to.
Yeah. I don't think I've met anybody who's a whiskey nerd who has an issue with that particular point.
There are folks that get hung up on the fact that they have not asked for the legal definite for the uh, legal labeling of it, so they are not.
Hmm.
Right? Don't label them something they're not, which it is what it is.
Yeah, being a more specific thing. Um, that was one of my thoughts on the regulations we'll get into. About like what do you call it? Texas American single malt whiskey, American Texas single malt whiskey? Like what like what do we do with that? Because
Right.
that's the way the rules are written. You have to have the exact phrase American single malt whiskey,
Hmm.
which precludes the use of a region. Um, and that's one of the things that I had to comment on. Maybe that's all there is to say on it. Basically, I propose if you say a more specific region, you can drop the American in favor of say Texas or Oregon or
So okay, this will dovetail in relatively nicely, right? So one of the standards in there is it's made from 100% malted barley, right? Why is that not just 100% a single malted grain?
yeah, that's it is a really core important question. I think I honestly think American drinkers are going to have a hard time understanding what the definition of single malt is. I think the etymology of single malt
Mm-hmm.
and the regulatory background of American whiskey are a bit at odds in terms of going from one to understanding the other. You almost have to come from Scotch to understand what single malt is.
Well, so I understand globally what single
Yeah.
malt is, and I understand why Scotch is the way it is, right? Because corn was not an option. Let's just we'll not talk about rye altogether, but corn was not an option for Scotland and England when Scotch was being made. And corn is a very very North American crop, based off of kind of where it was grown, where it was where it kind of came into being, where it was um, brought forward. But if we're calling it, if we're not saying it's um, single malt barley, right? Like that's not what we're calling this thing. It is a single malt. Keeping with the strict naming of it, you're just saying it has to be 100% a single malted grain of some type. It opens up a whole other thing. You could have triticale, you could have um, wheat, you could have barley, you could have rye, you could have corn, any single grain, rice for that matter. If you can malt it, it could be a single grain. And for the United States specifically, right? Because we're looking for an American version of this. Why are we chasing the exact same standard that Scotch has when we could have the freedom to play a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think there's a fair criticism there. For one thing, there's things we copied from the Scotch definition that don't necessarily seem like they have a place in
Mm-hmm.
American regulations. And there's just as many things that we kind of left behind because it was obvious they wouldn't gel. Um, I think that it's a what you the question that you've asked, why does it have to be malted barley instead of malted rye or malted wheat or malted corn, which I think exists but is really hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, well, malted rice is almost not a thing. Making rice whiskey almost requires a separate ingredient anyway. We can get into that. Um, but like, let's spend some time talking about American single malt because that's what we actually promised.
Yep.
Um, it's a really key question. I think everyone is going to ask, and I think the answer is unfortunately not simple. But it is helpful to mention that um, in the American whiskey regulations as they stand today, without the American single malt proposal, which hasn't been legislated until, which hasn't been like landed as a law yet. It's still in proposal, or still in consideration. Um, the regulations as they exist today do name malt whiskey, where malt is a shorthand for malted barley. There is also malt rye whiskey specifically called out in the
Mm-hmm.
American regulations. And what those definitions mean are at least 51% malted barley in your mash bill gives you a malt whiskey. And like most other American whiskey has to be aged in new charred oak. And same for if you were doing malted rye or rye malt, I think is what they call it in the regulations. A rye malt whiskey would be 51% malted rye. It's just that term malt is a shorthand for malted barley in our regulations and in the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So for whatever reason, the whole world has decided that that's a thing. Malted barley based whiskey is a distinctive enough product and with a long enough history that malt whiskey is a way to refer to that. Uh, it's a really good question, though. I think um, it's going to be most helpful for people to sort of see the global context of where American single malt is coming from. American single malt is kind of coming on the almost on the tail end of a trend that the whole world is making whiskey now in a style that was made famous by Scotland.
Mhm.
Scotland has single malt Scotch whiskey, which almost everybody has heard of, even if they didn't know what it meant. Right? Like long before I knew what a single malt was, I had heard the phrase single malt Scotch whiskey. I'd also heard the phrase single malt Japanese whiskey or Japanese single malt whiskey. So I sort of like knew there's a commonality, right? Some people will call it like Japanese Scotch because single malt and Scotch are so intertwined in sort of the history and the recognition these days that people think of single malt and Scotch as synonyms, and they'll refer to single malt from other countries as, Japanese Scotch or Australian Scotch or American Scotch. And Scotch is actually an adjective meaning a product of Scotland. So if it's made in another country, you can't actually call it Scotch, and that's more of a pedantry thing than anything. It doesn't help the teaching if you tell someone like, you know, you called my American single malt whiskey a Scotch. It's not a Scotch. Right,
Right.
like you end up being the pedantic pretentious person in the room instead of helpful. um so yeah, the whole world, right, like sort of started with Scotland, and then like Japanese whiskey became really famous because of Yamazaki winning a competition again, a single malt competition, a medal in a single malt something that beat out Scotch whiskeys. It was a specific expression of Yamazaki, really old something in a sherry cask. I forget exactly how old it was. Like not the entire brand beats every brand in Scotland. It's just that everybody that was entered in that thing and every bottle that was there, it happened that the Japanese whiskey won. But that got them on the map, and everybody started thinking like, oh, countries other than Scotland can make single malt. Why don't I?
Hmm.
Um, so Australia's making single malt, and Israel's making single malt, and lo and behold, American distillers have been quietly making single malt. They just couldn't call it anything other than maybe if they were using new charred oak, they could call it malt whiskey. And they just happen to
Hmm.
have a mash bill of 100% malted barley. Westward is an example of that, actually. Or like McCarthy's, the first American single malt, they were using refill casks and making a whiskey that was very much almost identical to the style of Scotch whiskey, heavily peated Scotch whiskey. Um, and they were just doing it because they liked that style of whiskey. It turns out that when you use whiskey in most of the world, mostly they don't use the E,
Hmm.
but the term whiskey, most people are going to think you're talking about Scotch or something in that style. It's only in the United States that the default interpretation of whiskey is bourbon.
In some parts of the United States, I would challenge that's still not necessarily the case everywhere, but in some parts.
Probably true. At least where I was, if somebody said whiskey and bourbon were almost interchangeable.
Because I think if I remember correctly, and I could be off, but like the number one selling whiskey brand in the United States is Jack Daniels, which is not bourbon, right? And so now you're just
That's true.
like whiskey default at this point is really about just whiskey, right? That there's not a
Yeah.
there's not a bourbon specific. Bourbon gets, I think in your and my circle, that is absolutely true. When we talk about American whiskey, we talk about bourbon. But if you look at the global consumer, the North American consumer, um, it's all just whiskey to them.
Yeah. I'll say this though, at least in the circles that I grew up in and in my family, sort of until single malt sort of entered the vocabulary and the style of products that people were interested in, uh, most people sort of, even if they didn't think Jack Daniels was a bourbon, and they'd
Mm-hmm.
maybe been pedantically corrected, it's a Tennessee whiskey, it's not bourbon, right? You're sort of in that phase of learning about whiskey. I think that most people viewed them as products like bourbon and Tennessee whiskey or products that serve the same purpose. You make the same cocktails with them, you do the same
Mm-hmm.
kind of shots with them. You're drinking them pretty much the same way. And then you've got single malt, where somebody went to Scotland and bought an $80 bottle, and they only bring it out around Christmas,
Mm-hmm.
right? The fancy drink. And there's less expensive and less fancy scotches too. But I think that's sort of how people think of it. It's like this is whiskey, bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, that sort of thing that has this particular job. And then you've got single malts one way or another that have this other kind of job, and you usually call them you would usually call them Scotch until you learn or somebody corrects you, and that sticks with you.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I guess in terms of the regulation, right? It's not law yet, right? Why can't we say a single malt is any single type of malt, right? Could be any grain that you malted. That's a single malt. I think the answer for that is if you just look at the regulations in a vacuum and you don't consider the history and the products that are actually being made in the world, it's a really good question. Why can't we make the category more open like that? Um, you might say like maybe in opposition to like what the rest of the world is doing, we feel that if we have a malted barley single malt, now we have to put barley on the label too to make that distinction. We have to
Mhm.
start putting mash bills everywhere. I think as soon as you zoom out of American regulations or you start thinking about what this means for labeling, this is probably the best answer to the question. Uh, if you make a category too open, you have to be more verbose on the labeling, and that tends to confuse customers. And TTB, you know, all the way back to the Bottled and Bond Act, they want to protect consumers and make sure the consumer knows what they're buying.
Mhm.
Right? Didn't used to be under the TTB, but right, like that regulatory responsibility has always been about consumer protection and clarity. The reason that they've basically been able to say like, hey, let's make American single malt is look at these 200 something distilleries that are making whiskey in the style of Scotland, and there's no label that they can put on it that gives them credit for doing that work.
Right.
So they're having to work extra hard to explain to customers what it is that they have, and customers aren't drawing the connection that this product from this producer is the same style as this product from this other producer, right? Uh, McCarthy's. Uh, Man, I wish I had pulled that bottle out. I'm gonna go pull the bottle out because there's a great
Go for
turn
it.
of phrase.
It's always great broadcasting when you turn your back to the camera. And I say that as a person who has absolutely done that any number of times. So I'm just,
You got to make sure that your shirt is long enough.
yeah, absolutely. Make sure it didn't roll up while you were sitting in your office chair, squirming around. That's
and
one
and
of
and
my
hopefully it
biggest
was.
problems that exists. And I want to frame out that question was actually posed to me in one of the off-air portions of commentary that I was having with a North American producer who actually does make American single malt. They were concerned that it was unnecessarily restrictive and allowing for exploration. And we understand the need to differentiate between malt whiskey and what American single malt is gonna be because it is more artful than the standard definition of a malt whiskey, but allowing at least more latitude for people to be creative in what they're doing, right? Because the process stays the same, the quality can stay the same. The thing that changes is the grain that's represented in the American single malt. And at that point, their question was really hinging around like, okay, if this is what it is, why are we just not calling it single malt in the United States at that point, right? And giving it the American nomenclature like it's something uniquely different. So going back to the McCarthy thing, but that's the sort of the context.
Yeah, I want to talk more about what makes the style the style. I think that's important for people to know
Mm-hmm.
if you're like, why should I be interested in single malt? Or why, yeah, I mean, like, let's just say that. Why should you be interested in single malt? And then we can take it a step further. Why should you be interested in American single malt? So prior to there being a definition of American single malt, well, usually what you'll see is basically labeling guidelines say you can't put whiskey on the same line in the same font as a designation of what type of whiskey it is, unless it is a legal category and you meet that
Mm-hmm.
definition. So, what happens with American single malt whiskey today is most often you'll get something like this. Um, Hopefully, that
Mm-hmm.
shows up well on the stream, where it says I'm reading it backwards. McCarthy's Oregon Single Malt,
Yep.
and then way down the label we have a different size and different color and different font, and there's words in between, and it finally says whiskey.
Uh huh.
As far as the TTB is concerned, this bottle contains whiskey. Doesn't contain any specific type of whiskey. For that, you are trusting what's written on the label, which they also approve.
Right.
But you're trusting the producer to explain to you what is in this bottle because all this is whiskey. It doesn't fit into any more specific category as far as the TDB is concerned. And so what this says in total, McCarthy's Oregon single malt, single barrel cask strength whiskey, distilled from fermented mash of peat malted Scottish barley, barrel aged a minimum of 3 years. That is what this bottle is. And they had to
Mm-hmm.
say all of that because there's no legal definition that says Oregon single malt whiskey means these things.
Right.
And on top of that, they did manage to fit in, like, yes, they had this barley. They got this barley from Scotland. The barley was peat malted in Scotland. It was aged a minimum of 3 years, which is the requirement for Scotch in Scotland. The first American single malt was because Steve McCarthy went to Scotland and fell in love with, if I'm not mistaken, Lafroig, and wanted to make that. He said, I am a craft distiller. Why don't I make that style of thing? And so that's what he did. And that was the first American single malt. Leaving aside, like, let's innovate on the category, what you have here, you could almost argue my favorite whiskey is, spiritually speaking, a Scotch. It just happens
Mm-hmm.
to be made in America.
Right.
Um,
It meets all the standards of it. It meets all the
yes,
standards aside
if
from its geography.
yes, if this had been made, aged, and bottled in Scotland, it could be called a Scotch.
Mm-hmm.
It is 100% all of those things. Not all of American single malt whiskey is or will be, because the regulations are sort of by necessity to fit into the other styles of American spirits, had to be different, more lenient, more strict, both. So yeah, that gets into an interesting. There's a corner of the rules which makes the single malt definition really frustrating. We have malt whiskey, we have American malt whiskey, we have American straight malt whiskey. Put any state that you want.
Mm-hmm.
All that says is it has to be at least 51% barley. So if you made something, if you put single, right? If you put, Oregon single, and then you did some other funny thing and you moved malt down and you said malt whiskey, well, now this would have to be aged in new oak, and you also don't guarantee it's 100% malted barley. And that's significant because there's just a long-standing tradition of making whiskey from 100% malted barley.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do with that? We have this sort of thing where we're saying, okay, let's relax the cask type because, so let's explain what single malt is as a style. So single malt says 100% malted barley. We've beaten that point to death. It doesn't give any restriction on the type of cask other than it is oak. In some countries, just wood. In Australia, for example, it just has to be a wooden cask. It doesn't have to be oak. That's a fun bit of trivia. Most countries do say oak, though. For most countries, it has to be aged a minimum of 3 years. There's no minimum age requirement in the United States unless you put straight on the label, in which case the minimum age is 2 years. I'm forgetting my regulations now, but I forget if it's less than 4 years old but more than 2, you can call it straight, but you have to say how old it is. If it's less than 2 years old, you can't call it straight whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
There's other things about additives and blending and putting from different states and all that sort of stuff. It's minutiae in the law.
Yeah. I think if it's straight and it's under 4 years, you have to say how many years it is. But if it's over 4 years after straight, you don't have to put the age statement on it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's under 4 years you have to give an age. None of this really matters to the consumer, I think. I mean, these days, the idea that you're getting something that isn't quite whiskey is a problem that's so long in the past that people have forgotten.
But my question is it though? Because what you're talking about is TTB, right?
Yeah.
And this is going to be a rabbit hole, and I'm fine with that. TTB is validating the label. Are they validating that what goes in the bottle is actually what's on the label?
Oh man, I have questions. There's a lot of things in the world where we just have to trust.
See, the thing is that we can't. And I have an article that I'll share with you later on that a friend of mine wrote around a very specific brand and a labeling issue that happened this year. Very, very specific labeling issue that happened this year.
I may have heard of this.
That sort of obscures the standards of identity of a particular whiskey that is on the shelf. It got rectified, but only because, well, in my mind, only because the person who wrote the article did so before it actually hit market, and so new labels were miraculously printed up and stuck on these bottles or whatever. But
Hmm.
there was nothing preventing that from happening. So, kind of bringing this all back around is that what is the consequence if they don't? We largely trust, and I think with most of our craft distillers, they've got a lot more on the line than some of the major folks do. So I think we probably can, but
Yeah. Let's put it this way. Mislabeling your product is intentionally or unintentionally breaking the law. There are consequences for breaking the law, and intent matters. And to some extent, it comes down to how much money can you afford to fight if you get caught doing something intentionally or unintentionally that is against the law,
mhm.
and how much can you stake your reputation on doing something wrong. So I think the law exists, and the albeit sporadic enforcement of the law serves to keep everyone at least a little more honest. But yeah,
I
you can't
mean,
100% trust. I mean, I work in tech. I'm an engineer in tech, and I'm constantly thinking about, what can you trust and what can't you trust, right? What
right.
assumptions are being violated, or how can the system be abused by someone who wants to get your personal information out of a product or whatever, right? Like, trust is a big problem, and most of the time, the best answer that we have for anything is it's better to trust with the risk of being burnt than to not
Hmm.
trust and have no convenience or enjoyment in your life. There's a I don't, I'm a nerd across all dimensions. If you want to have a fun, maybe depressing, disturbing read, um, there's a there's a particular person who is very famous in the. I don't want to necessarily give extra like name cred to this person, but probably everybody's heard of Richard Stallman.
Hmm.
Um, he's big important in like the Linux and GNU and like all this sort of open source stuff, and he's got a website. And on that website, it looks like a 90s website because it basically is, right? He uses no, in his own personal life, right? He's got these whole manifestos about like, I don't use a regular web browser. I've got a bot that goes to a website and emails me the text content of the website if it's something that I really want to read, and all
Hmm.
other sorts of ridiculous, ludicrous things that are like, this is a technology leader from decades ago that to this day is almost a luddite when it comes to certain forms of technology. And there's something behind that. Like, anytime we give ourselves a little extra convenience, you end up opening the door to some kind of an attack,
Hmm.
or a data leak, or you're being fingerprinted by Google so that when you go to Facebook, they know that you're the same person, even if you're using a different login. Like, you could be terrified of these things, or you could just accept that this is the way things are and that there are people like me who are trying to make it better with our day jobs.
Hmm.
And that's pretty much all we could do.
Yeah, I mean, like I mean, we regularly worry about is somebody looking at us through a satellite, but carry around homing beacons in our pockets daily, right? Like I get that.
It's never
Um,
been easier to track us.
Never. I mean, this is absolutely never, unless somebody's carrying around a Faraday pouch in their pocket and putting their phone inside of it, and then it completely defeats the purpose of having it.
That thought has crossed my mind, though.
About
I
having
I
one or
I really
using one.
like know about putting some kind of Faraday cage around my telecom devices, because every once in a while something in the tech news happens and you go, maybe that tinfoil hat looks a little better than it used to.
It's starting to look a little bit more shiny and a little less wrinkled. Like it's
Yeah,
looking a little more like a smart man's play.
yeah. It's really
Significant.
refreshing to go on a multi-day hike where there's no cell service. Like, you start to ask the question, like, if I got into trouble, how would I get rescued? Right? Like, the
Hmm.
answer is ignoring that fear. It's so
Like
beautiful to just be
the same way
disconnected.
someone was rescued in 1985.
Yeah, like, it's gonna have
Maybe
you'll
they
find
were,
a
maybe they
way.
weren't.
We don't carry
That's
satellite phones on these kinds of trips usually, though, and that would be the thing, right?
Mhm.
If you need it, you can use it. You'll find a way to communicate. But if you just go out there with the technology of these days, the smartphones that assumes you're within a certain distances of a cell tower, and you go a mile plus up into the sky and 50 miles away from civilization, yeah, you're not gonna get a phone call out. Sorry. There's just, no matter how hard you try, no matter how high you hold that phone up, you're just not gonna be able to get into contact with anybody. So you better be able to get yourself out of there, or you're gonna wait for another hiker to come along.
So I don't know if you're watching the chat at all, but
Oh, I'm
I
not.
think one of your friends is here has indicated that you can buy pre-made Faraday bags, probably on Amazon at this point. But there may be a little section on the right hand side of StreamYard that shows you the ability to open up comments.
Oh man, Oh wow. Okay, so StreamYard actually does have a comments tab, and I completely have
Yeah,
just been ignoring it the whole time.
no,
Probably.
no, no. There's not really a reason to, other than I know this person is directly attached to you and um, added in a comment that really mattered to the conversation.
Yeah.
You
It's
got a few
it's
fans here.
I haven't been good at reading chat on my own podcast. I think it's more distracting than helpful in terms of covering content.
It
But thank you all
usually
for tuning
is.
in. I appreciate
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
What
I
were we
actually saw that
talking about?
Caitlin Bartlemay is listening in, and I really
Yeah,
appreciate that.
she's the one that indicated that you can buy pre-made Faraday bags.
Like we're gonna have a chat about that this Friday.
Yeah. Um,
All right, I'm
so
gonna turn that off again so that I don't get distracted.
how do we get back to American single malt from Faraday bags?
I think we just do a hard segue.
Hard segue. Hard segue.
Here, let's taste these whiskeys that we poured. That's a
You know,
hard
I've already
segue.
I've already drank through the Pinot and the sourdough at this point just by casually sipping. Now I say drank through like I had a bunch of it. I had like I think I've got like
Yeah.
three quarters of an ounce pours.
Yeah, I
What
guess
about this?
for the sake of your audience, I didn't really introduce myself in terms of my like why my name is what my name is. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I go by DemiTastes around the internet, and a big reason for that is that I've always had usernames that started with Demi, going back to when I was a teenager. Um, I was Demi Reticent for a while because I thought it sounded cool. I was Demi Meta when Demi Reticent was too long, and that was my gamer tag for a while. When I joined Discord and I was in the whiskey discords, I named myself Demi Malt. And then I realized that if I wanted to make like any kind of a social media following, it'd be cool to have like kind of a punny name.
Hmm.
So since I was getting into coffee at that time, there's this tiny espresso cup. It's like a 2 or 3 ounce cup about this big that has a little handle on it. They call it DemiTastes. And I said, oh, well, I'm sort of famous around the internet for pouring a half ounce at a time or like less. Like
Hmm.
whenever I post a picture review, I usually have a tiny amount of whiskey in my glass because I'm not trying to like show off with 2 ounces in my glass. I think a half ounce looks fine. All right, this is the amount that I prefer to drink. And so
Right.
tiny tastes, like demi means like partial. So like taking the demi tastes and the concept that I do small pours together, and calling myself demi taste, it seemed to fit.
So why did you adopt Demi to begin with? Is this like demigod? Is this like what was the?
No, I suppose it's a little unfortunate because of the associations. Like you've got women are named Demi, like Demi Lovato, and so like I think people who I'm not trying to appear as a woman on the internet, but I think that there may have been one or two people who
I
thought
was
that at
really
one
just
point or
going with
another.
demigod. I was like, oh, you consider yourself a demigod? That's fine.
Yeah, there's also that unfortunate connotation. Yeah, I think it was I actually I had a friend who I'm sure that this screen name has been long retired, but like on AOL Instant Messenger, I had a friend whose name was Rogue Ascetic. And I thought that was a cool, like just put two cool words together, and like I thought that was the coolest thing because it wasn't like
Right.
everybody's putting like X's and Z's all over the place and weird capitalization. I mean, this guy's just
Right.
like, no, I'm gonna be two words and it's going to be like a normal name. And I thought that was cool. I wanted to follow that. And like, I was a swimmer at the time. So I was in the middle of doing a 30-minute, like, I actually remember this. We called it a T30. It was swim for 30 minutes and see how far you can go. And this was like a fitness test that we did once a year,
Hmm.
basically. Um, and so like I was in the middle of that and they had thrown like the 15-minute, like they have these medicine balls that you have in the gym.
Hmm.
They threw this 15-minute medicine ball in the pool, like you're halfway done, just so you know, right? Like, but you're just gonna keep swimming anyway. And I remember that going in, and like sometime after that, I was just like, I don't know, I just suddenly had a clue. I felt like Demi Reticent was a cool name, and I just went with that. Just like it stuck. That had the unfortunate, like the abbreviation of that was DR. So some friends who started calling me doctor.
So,
By the way, I don't have a PhD. I'm not a doctor. I don't want to
not
take
yet.
any credit for that. I
Is that
don't. I
a
have.
future plan?
I
No
no
aspirations.
no aspirations to get a PhD. I did academics for 6 years and burnt out on it. And a master's is good enough for me.
Yeah, I would in the realm that you work in. I don't know that a PhD largely helps
The
significantly.
master's didn't help at all. Got me no benefit in terms of paycheck or job opportunities or anything. Like
You know,
basically nobody cares.
I did my MBA as a vanity project entirely, and that's a story for a whole other day. It was just a really really expensive self help situation. Um,
I think you told that story on another one of your podcast
oh,
episodes. So
I've
I can
talked
just
about
tell
it a
your listeners,
bunch of
hey, go
times.
listen to those old episodes and you'll find out
Yeah,
that story.
I've talked about it several times. Lots of people go to college for 10 years. They're
Yeah,
usually
we've
called
been we
doctors.
sort of we I guess made contact on Instagram something like 3 weeks ago, and then
Mhm.
probably immediately started researching each other.
Yep.
And like you were saying on another podcast, it feels like stalking, except if you slap a podcast on it, everything is fine.
Yeah, it's okay. Like you can literally like dig through to the bottom of someone's LinkedIn if they give you all their information and find lots of stuff. I did that with one of the distillers I was talking to, and he was like, "Man, you really went back there." I was like, yeah, I mean, I don't want to ask the same questions everybody else is asking, so you got to find the kind of the deep cuts.
Yeah,
Um,
speaking of the deep cuts, if you want to move on from American Single Malt now, I have more to say, but we can move on.
I don't know.
Um,
I can talk about it for a long time. But so this medicine ball that they were throwing at you, were they throwing it at you in the pool? Like, is that
oh no
somebody's
no,
job? Is it
so
like a coach's job?
yeah, so the coach basically we had no way like you've got your goggles on, but you're looking at
Yeah,
the bottom of the pool basically,
and
right?
you
So
don't
you're
hear
swimming.
anything because your ears are underwater, right?
Yeah, you're swimming for 30 minutes. You've got no way of hearing or seeing anything. You're not going to stop to look at the clock because you got to clear your eyes and look, and you're
Mm-hmm.
just wasting time that you could be swimming, right? So every 5 minutes, they would drop a medicine ball of a different color into the pool. And the pool that we were swimming in at the time angled towards the middle. So they
Mm-hmm.
would just drop the medicine ball in on the side and it would roll down towards the middle and everybody would see it.
Yeah, no, I was super
It
excited. I thought
wasn't
there
like
was like
somebody
some
was
coach
chunking a
just like
medicine
hucking a
ball towards
ball
the
at
middle of
you.
the pool. Yeah, it
Like
actually was
it's
way more
part of
convenient
the
than that.
the fear of the moment is adding that. This is why I would be a terrible coach because that's the thing that I'd be like, yeah, no, we're doing that. We're good luck. I hope you can dodge. It's a part of the swimming test that exists.
Yeah, if you can dodge a medicine ball, it would hurt. I mean, they're like 5 pounds or something. You can get them all
Absolutely,
different
but I mean,
sizes.
like
Yeah.
it's gonna be cushioned a little bit because you're just gonna get pushed down in the water. It's not like throwing it at you and bouncing you off a wall or anything like
Yeah,
that.
but imagine you're like, imagine you get hit with a giant flying 5 pound object with some velocity, and you're in the middle of, you're tired and whatever, and just like all of a sudden you just got hit by something. You would freak out, probably swallow some
I
water.
have two children. That's happened to me. Like that's happened to me a number of times. Anywhere from 5 to 25 pound object randomly hitting you when you're tired. It's a
Yeah.
different kind of tired. It's not like physical exhaustion. It's more like mental exhaustion. Like why? You know.
Competitive swimming is probably another niche that this audience probably has no overlap with, but I think anybody who's been a swimmer for enough hours
Mm.
will totally understand that for absolutely no reason at all, you'll suddenly inhale water and spend the next 5 minutes coughing and trying to recover, hanging onto the lane lines, hanging onto the side of the pool, getting out, getting on all fours and just like coughing your lungs out until
Hmm.
until it's clear, and you feel like such an idiot. But it happens to everybody, right? I
Yeah.
probably in 11 years of competitive swimming, 5 or 6 days a week, 2 hours a day, go add up how many hours of swimming that was. Like everything has happened to me a dozen times.
Hmm.
I have scars on my hands from hitting the lane ropes that I can still see. Like I guess I feel like you could probably look at a swimmer's hands, and everybody's had this, especially if you've ever swam butterfly,
Hmm.
because the lane is only like 8 feet wide. And if you're not directly down the center, which you're not going to be
Right.
if you're circle swimming, you've got a whole bunch of people in the lane and you got to pass each other. You're not going to be directly down the center of the lane. And if you don't take a perfect stroke, your hands are going to scrape on
You're
those
there.
lane lines. Yeah, and
Yeah.
then you get bloody knuckles, and that's just part of swimming.
American single malt.
Yeah, there's nowhere to go from there.
No. Like here's the hard shit. Like, why are there not more distillers attempting to use American peat?
That is a great question. I would love to know the answer to that. I wanted to check my facts before I put this out there, but I once talked with Joe O'Sullivan about whether he was going to try to use American Pete, and I
Hmm.
believe the answer at the time was a maybe. And I don't remember if he was saying that he was going to use the same Skagit Valley peat that Westland and Copperworks have used,
Hmm.
or if there was something closer to uh, like the Willamette River Valley or something like that in Oregon that they might be able to use. Um, Maybe Caitlin can elucidate in chat if there's any plans.
Yeah, and that I mean that's one that I'm keeping around forever because like I didn't know that peat in the U.S. was a thing until maybe like 2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Because I
So
started
I can speak to
exploring.
that. It turns out there's a lot of peat in the United States.
Yeah,
And like in most of the world, it's mostly used for gardening. It's a very nutrient rich, basically soil that is used. You've probably seen gardening peat moss in your
yeah.
Lowe's or Home Depot garden center.
No,
It's all over the
I
place.
distinctly remember as a child being used as manual labor because that's what you do. You have kids for manual labor,
That's
and
right.
like there was a
Farm
lot of like
tradition.
spreading peat moss as a child,
Yeah.
but it didn't ever connect. And even after I learned about Scottish peat, right, like I just assumed peat and peat moss were two different things, right?
Yeah. Take it.
Uh,
There's a connection to draw. I think
right.
peat moss may be slightly less decomposed than like peat that they end up using.
Yeah.
For one thing, we like to think. I think in Scotch whiskey, we like to think of peat as being like it's bricks that you burn in a kiln, right? You know, bricks. What is it? Coal? Is it wood? Like what is it? No, it turns out it's basically mud
Yep.
that they dried out and cut. And then, like, yes, it's brick shaped now, but you could pull it apart and it has sort of a fibrous, like, there's plant matter in there.
Hmm.
Um, Now
And it's
in
more widespread across the United States than I thought as well. Like that was the other
yeah,
thing that like because it was I think 2000 it was 2021 when I did my first episode on American single malt, right? Because that was the American Single Malt Commission and talking about what they were working on, and this is the sad state of affairs is that like at that point in 2021 it was like September October of 2021 like we think we're gonna have an open comment period within the next 3 months.
yeah, that that got delayed a whole
Which,
bunch.
yeah, no joke, right? Because I was like super excited. I was like, sweet. And then I started digging into it and I look in and like, oh, there's peat in the United States. Not a ton of people are using it. Maybe it's because we don't have the traditional utilization of it. So harvesting isn't what it is everywhere else in the world. And then I got in one of those like YouTube rabbit holes of watching peat being harvested. Like,
Yeah,
oh, this is how this is actually
yeah.
done. Like, this is super interesting.
Yeah,
Learned
I
it to
think
me and
there's,
like three
as
other
I
people.
understand it, there's a few reasons.
Mhm.
I think that my interview with Jason Parker at Copperworks had some on this, although I haven't published that yet. And deepest apologies for that. I've been very busy. Uh,
It happens.
um, and also, you know, we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about podcasting and your path
Mhm.
through and my path through. Yeah, American peat throughout the world. Yes, it's used for gardening. You don't have to get it into like such a. You don't have to worry about can it burn a certain way, or does it have the right moisture, or does it have the right plants in it, or does it taste good? Um, and I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to whiskey production. Aside from if you can get past the regulatory, a lot of peat bogs in the United States, I think, are actually protected.
Mhm.
They're in like wetland
Wetlands.
designated areas that you can't disturb, or they're in national parks or whatever. So first of all, you got to find a peat bog that you can actually harvest from, and clearly there's a lot of those because they're using it for gardening purposes. The next thing is once you can get past the regulations of find a peat bog that you can use, get past some sort of regulations. Now choose from your peat bogs that you have access to. Uh, how are you going to figure out if it tastes good in whiskey? And like you can learn a lot from new make actually. So like if you're a whiskey
Mhm.
maker, you could probably run pretty quickly some experiments with peat and figure out how is this peat going to come across in this barley. There may even be a peat and barley combination that there's something there. Um, but you've got to figure out whether it tastes good, and in order to do that, you really need some time to develop it. And so Westland talks about developing with Skagit Valley malting, the Skagit Valley peat that they're using now in I believe what they said is all of their peated whiskey is going to go to Skagit Valley peat, which is kind of cool because they've gone
Mhm.
from Scottish peat to peated developing a peat bog to releasing um, the Solum, which just released this year. Um, the Solum is the Skagit Valley peated whiskey. To saying that they're dedicating, they're not laying down any new peated whiskey that isn't Skagit Valley peat. Or if that's not true yet, it's going to be true soon.
Mhm.
It's cool to see that kind of development happening, and that took a lot of work. Not only did they have to find the peat bog, they had to find the right corner of the peat bog that had a good flavor when they tested it. Um, so I think probably it's just a lot of work,
Mhm.
right? If you're a whiskey producer, so I think like an engineer. Um, if I was a whiskey producer, if I was a new whiskey producer, I was trying to build a product, and I wanted to figure out if there's a market for that product, right? Is there a market for American peated whiskey? There's a small market, but again, a lot of American whiskey drinkers are bourbon drinkers, and like peated bourbon is an interesting experiment that not a whole lot of bourbon makers are doing. There's notably the Buffalo Trace peated bourbon, for example, which was like small sample bottles only, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
There's been a couple of other peated bourbons
King's
out
County.
there. Yeah,
He's right over here. It is a unique flavor.
I might hit you up for a sample of that
Yeah,
actually
I got
because I
you.
haven't gotten a chance to try it yet. Um, yeah, and I think as far as bourbon drinkers are concerned, peated bourbon is like, oh, this is really smoky. Like this is kind of a strange new thing. And an Isla Scotch drinker is going to be like, what do you mean peated bourbon? It doesn't taste like smoke at all. There's so different levels of smoke. And then
Mhm.
there's another problem, which is Scotland has a lot of practice peating their barley, and they figured out how to get those really high um, peat levels, which is a non-trivial thing to do. Um, and so if you've got an American malting house doing peated whiskey for the first time, they're trying to figure out how do we actually make the barley get enough peat stuck to it, basically, that it's going to come through in the finished product that we're making.
Mhm.
Presumably, you're going to be using a pot still. I think we can eliminate that variable, or some kind of hybrid still that has, a lot of those flavors come through, not a column still, because you'd lose. You work that hard to make your peated barley, and then throw away as much
Strip it all
flavor as
out.
you can.
You're absolutely stripping it all out. Like
Yeah,
like you're using a still that is made for creating grain whiskey,
yeah.
or
So
grain
point being,
spirit, neutral grain spirit at that point.
if you were developing a peated American whiskey product and you knew that you could get peated malt from Scotland, and environmental concerns aside, let's say it doesn't cost that much to get the peated malt to the United States, as opposed to the whole cost of R&D and the wait time and all that sort of stuff. I don't know about you, but if I was an American single malt maker, I would be choosing the Scottish malt, at least to get started.
Hmm.
And then seeing, I personally am super intrigued by the idea of American peat. I want to see more of it. I think it's going to take some time. I think
Hmm.
Westland has done the favor to everybody of proving it's possible. I think
So
we're going to see a lot more of it.
I'll send you a couple more, and I think I may have like 1 ounce or half an ounce, um, of a couple of samples of the Whiskey Witch. Right. So Whiskey Witch is spirits of French lick. They did a wheat mash with Indiana peat. Indiana has peat bogs apparently, and so they have peated theirs. The first one that I had, it was distinctly peated, not like Scotch peated, but it was like you're like, okay, there's peat here. The second one just tasted a little bit smoky, like it was maybe even milder than your Colkegan's or your Del Box,
Yeah,
but it was unique.
I
But I'll
actually
send you
have
some over.
behind me, because I figured this question would come up. I have the Solum, and I also have Copperworks 043, which is their peated whiskey from the same peat bog, same malting house as Westland's was.
Hmm.
Um, and both of them come across to me as faint, like forest and sort of like campfire,
Hmm.
as a, like it's more earthy than smoky. It's not the medicinal like seaweed iodine that you get from an Isla peat. It's a very different character, and it's much more subtle than I expected, to be honest.
Hmm. And I wonder if that's because, most of the peat bogs, I mean, there's a salinity that's in the peat bogs in Ireland and Scotland, but it's largely freshwater that are feeding the peat bogs here. So maybe that's part of your difference at this point, right? Because
That could be.
the flora of it all is going to be distinctly unique. But
The
you
flora for
make you
sure.
make a really good point there that just because it's peat doesn't mean it's going to smoke well, right? In the same way that just because you can capture yeast doesn't mean it's going to create good flavors. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's going to taste terrible. A lot of folks learned that during the pandemic as they were trying to make sourdough in their homes and they're wild capturing yeast out of their kitchen, and they get some yeast off of an apple that they bought from the store that just doesn't make good bread.
Yeah, speaking of sourdough.
Speaking of sourdough, you like that transition that I built in there?
Yeah. So how did you think of the sourdough whiskey? You just got it today. I had a chance to try it a few days ago.
Yeah, so I haven't had anything from Westward that I've disliked. And that sort of sounds like I'm leading into like oh, but this is the one. Um it's good, bordering great, but I don't know that it's distinctly unique. What am I supposed to get out of this that I don't get out of a standard Westward or Westward cask strength at this point?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I feel the 2020 sourdough was more distinctive.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of recent releases, actually the Sauterne was one of the better ones.
Mm-hmm.
And also the two malts, which is a great re-segue back into American single malt.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to my Westward tour a year ago, and I went on the tour. There was a couple of other people who were not whiskey bloggers. They wrote me in as a whiskey blogger, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is funny. Like you show up at a distillery having sent somebody an email, and like you just send them your links, and then they'll variously decide, oh, you're an influencer, or you're a blogger, or you're a reviewer, or whatever. And the various labels that they assign to you are kind of funny because like I don't necessarily think of myself as any of those things. Or maybe like I wouldn't call myself an influencer. I like I said, I'm not very good at social media. I'm also not phoning it in. I feel like I'm working too hard and not achieving what I want to achieve with it.
So why wouldn't you call yourself an influencer?
Well, for one thing, I don't know to the extent that I'm influencing opinions. I think I'm
I
putting
mean,
information out into the
you have
world.
actually commented directly. There's at least one person that has made multiple purchases off of your recommendation.
That's true.
So
I think
by definition, that
as
makes
long
you an
as
influencer. It may
I
not be a
get,
huge
I
audience.
guess I that just feels awkward to say. I don't like to think of
It's
myself that way because like I'm not begging for product endorsements and I'm not trying to get people to buy things. I'm trying to put information out into the world. So like if I had to give
You're
myself
trying
a
to help people
label,
make informed decisions on whether they should buy something or not, but that doesn't
right.
immediately preclude you from being an influencer. And because I had this discussion with an actual influencer, like, and I say actual influencer, like this is a
So
person with a
you agree with me?
well, I mean, for like he's talking to me about, oh, you're an influencer. I'm like, no, I'm not. I've got X number of followers, and I just kind of say what I say. And he was like, that's not the point of it all. Is like you're putting a perspective out there that someone either agrees with or doesn't agree with. But if they agree with you and they trust you, then they may make a purchase. They may make a decision. They may do something. And what I think that you'll find as you grow sort of your platform and what you're trying to do, that as you grow, the number of people that listen to you stays the same, but the number of people that are following you grows, right? And so your influence audience still stays relatively small. And so you've got a influencer who has 50,000 followers. There's probably 50 that are making actual purchase decisions. Everyone else is just consuming content and moving on. Like that's largely what social media is at this point. And so for a lot of brands, and I think some smaller brands are recognizing this, is that it's not necessary to go out and find the guy with 100,000 followers and get them to talk about your whiskey. It's find the guy who has regular people who are commenting, who are engaging, who are making purchase decisions based off of it. So by that definition, and it feels icky, like you don't want to call yourself an influencer, like, ugh, that sounds gross. right?
Yeah, and
Because
I definitely
you're
don't
just
want
trying
to
to
call
be a
myself
helper.
an expert because I am a student, right? I'm still learning all of this stuff and I'm just putting
I
out
mean,
what I
you're an
learned.
expert to somebody, though, right? You're measuring it wrong, right? Because there's a large quantity of people below you that would
Yeah.
consider you at expert level, and there's a smaller quantity of people above you that would say you're not.
Yeah. I think the word expert in isolation is the problem.
Yep.
I think I agree with your take on that. I think in the context of, um, I don't entirely hate the fact that uh, certain people have called me like like the foremost community expert on American single malt as far as they
Hmm.
know, which is a highly qualified statement, but I love that
Hmm.
because that feels authentic to me, right? Like that's a
Right.
compliment that I can accept. If somebody were to call me an American single malt expert, I'd say no. Go talk to Joseph O'Sullivan. Go talk to Caitlin Bartlemay. Go talk to
Hmm.
Jason Parker. Go talk to um, Jared Himstead. Right? Go talk to the producers who have built their careers and their brands around making this stuff. They know more than I do, even if they're focused on just that one brand. Right? I
So
want
it's
to
three
know
people. You've influenced three people to make purchase decisions regularly, and I'm saying that because
somebody in the comments said it.
the
Three
comment section
people.
has indicated it's been at least three. Um,
Yeah.
I know that's a distinct aside, but um, calling yourself an expert feels weird. It's always going to. Calling yourself an influencer is going to feel weird. Um, and I say all of these things like, oh no, you're definitely an expert. You know, when coworkers find out like this is the hobby of mine, they're like, oh, there's the whiskey expert. I'm like, nah, I just like the things that I
Yeah.
like.
You can be the expert in the room. I think there's nuance, right? As long as people don't think that you're saying that you are the foremost, that you are the superlative.
Right.
I don't think
That you are
people don't
the
make absolute
apex.
statements like that. I shouldn't say that. People make absolute statements like that all the time. The kind of
Reasonable
reasonable
people.
person that I
There
like
you
to
go.
hang out with.
Reasonable
Yeah,
people
reasonable
don't
people.
make.
Exactly. Yeah, reasonable people don't make absolute statements about that. I'm the best at everything, right? I've been playing music for 22 years and I am there there are few people in the music groups that I'm in that I would say are, you know, below me, right? I think that I'm bottom of the barrel, right?
So,
Like
but what happens whenever someone that you say is an expert says you're an expert?
the universe implodes.
But like in the comments right here, like Caitlin literally says, "IW an expert." Right? So you
Oh
threw it to
no.
her and she threw it right back to you. It was like, nah.
You know what? Instead of being pithy, and I'm not going to reject the compliment because I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I am just gonna say, I think it is possible for people to be experts in different ways about different things,
Mm-hmm.
and surrounding yourself with experts in things that are different from what they think you're an expert in is the way to, build build a better you, enhance your learning, whatever buzzwords that you want to throw out, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
just the richness of life comes from the diversity of other people.
Okay. So this is maybe a relatively easy transition at this point. So how long have you've been podcasting and you've been writing reviews for a long time? How long have you been doing this podcasting thing? Like when did this begin?
Yeah, the podcasting thing, we've been doing it. I believe we've done I believe it's been 4 months. Our first podcast was actually on 420, which I remember because everyone remembers that number. Um, and that was a complete coincidence. But it is funny. And what we did was we just we had a whole bunch of ideas that we'd been I have a private Discord with a collection of people whose opinions I respect and who were interested in being part of planning. Um, a podcast actually wasn't the first thing that we were trying to do. Um, I when the American Single Malt when the TTB um the notice of proposed rulemaking for the American Single Malt, when the TTB published their proposal, I happened to be traveling in Texas to visit family. I immediately said, I have to talk to Jared Himstead. So I sent Balcones an email and I said, I am a whiskey reviewer. Go look. At
Mm-hmm.
that point, I'd done my American Single Malt Advent, so I had 27 solid reviews, all in one place that people could go look at. And I said, "Here, I'm a reviewer. this is like my entire resume of like these are my thoughts about American single malt. I've reviewed, McCarthy's and Balcones and Copperworks and a few others. Um, I want to talk to you about the the proposal as written, because I already knew what the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission wanted, and I read the proposal and I said that matches, but, and I
Mm-hmm.
had all these questions, and I went and did this interview and I recorded it. And sometime after that, I got home and I sent Jared an email and I said, "Hey, I'm going to send you a transcript." I made a promise that I wasn't actually fully equipped to, um, like, I was going to edit and then send a transcript and get his approval before I actually published it as a podcast. Um, I didn't know how I was going to do that,
Mm-hmm.
and I still haven't published that interview. I've made references to. Oh, no, so what, so sorry, to back up. I wasn't a podcaster. I was a reviewer, and I had this idea that I had done so much thinking about American single malt whiskey, and I had so many questions that I felt only producers could answer. Whether I listen to other interviews or do my own primary research, I wanted to write a book on American single malt whiskey. I still do. That's no longer the immediate goal because it's a big lift for somebody who only writes reviews online, who is unknown in any other way, doesn't have an audience for the book, whatever. It just, I would toil in silence for 2 3 years trying to write a book, and find a publisher and maybe do some marketing with the public. I was just kind of thinking through this whole thing. Like, I introduced myself as a reviewer who wanted to write a book on American single malt whiskey, and I realized after doing two interviews, I had no idea how I was actually going to take the steps to do that because I've never written a book before. I've written blogs on various topics, mostly music, tech, the things that I've been involved in before, but never with any regularity. It's like sometimes you have an idea that feels worth writing down. With whiskey, I felt like on a daily basis I had an idea that felt worth writing down. Either it was a review, or it was some exploration of like, oh, how do sherry casks work, or like what's this deal with new oak versus reused oak, or you know why isn't there more American peat? Like, I've asked these questions, and mostly I've answered in private on the Discord.
Mm-hmm.
So I am not really a blogger because I don't actually publish that much. I'm a reviewer because I do publish the reviews on Reddit. And I've started publishing the reviews on a private blog because Reddit had a bit of a crisis. I don't use Reddit so much anymore because they killed the app that I was using. I was using RIF, which was
Mm-hmm.
formerly known as Reddit is Fun before Reddit said you can't use the trademark name. And then Reddit killed the API, so now the apps can't run. So all these mobile apps, like, I was mostly using Reddit on mobile from the app, and I can't anymore. So I'm not really on Reddit much anymore because it's so much harder. Like, I have to, instead of, I've got the picture on my phone already and I can upload it and I can type my thoughts and publish it all in one place. I can't do that anymore. So it's like, and as long as I'm going to be working harder sitting at my computer, I want to control the publishing platform. So I'm currently part of a review blog called maltrunners.com, MALT Malt Runners. Um, has nothing to do with running. I don't exactly know why we chose that name, but it's sort of a collective of I don't know, a dozen or so people who we all respect each other's reviews and opinions. And like, even on Reddit, we're mostly reading each other's reviews. So we said, okay, if Reddit is going to die the slow death, which, ended up not happening, right? Like, all the subreddits came back online, everything's healthy and whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
like, we have our own opinions about like where Reddit is going in terms of the audience and the type of people who comment and the types of comments that you get, and whether it's a good place to write your reviews anyway. But like, for the people who still use Reddit, Reddit's fine. It's just that we got shaken loose, and we felt we'd rather publish for each other and for people who were searching for our reviews online, instead of putting our stuff into the soup of Reddit and hoping that people see it, right? You put things on Reddit and I think as a whiskey reviewer, you're mostly hoping that people search for the product that you reviewed, more so than you're hoping that people see your review right when it's posted and actually like upvote and
Yeah.
comment and everything. And like I said, for me, I want to put a review out there as the start of a conversation, and I want to have a conversation. And what happens on Reddit is, people see a review that is a product they don't recognize, they don't even click on it, or they see a picture that looks pretty and they upvote, and they don't actually upvote the review itself that's sitting in the comments. Or worse, you give an honest review and you put a rating on it, and somebody who either doesn't understand your rating scale or just disagrees with you says that you're wrong, and it kind of derails into toxicity. And You collect a couple of dozen upvotes and you move on with your life. And like there's the whole I posted on social media and now I have anxiety about how it's doing. That like, you post on Reddit and you post on Instagram and you post on Twitter and you're refreshing and checking all of this stuff, or you just say, I don't care. Because what I really
Hmm.
want is I want to write this review and I'm going to post it in all those places just so that it's searchable and findable in the world and people can benefit from it. And what I really want to happen is I'm going to post it on Discord and I'm going to talk to people about that experience that I just had because that's how I want to enjoy whiskey. So I said, okay, why don't I just lean into that more? I like having conversations. So what I want to do is I want to talk to producers and have conversations, and I hope that a book comes out of it. But if a book doesn't come out of it, I can release this content along the way because other people can benefit from these conversations that I had. And then I said, well, okay, how am I going to do that? I should make a podcast. Okay, how am I going to make a podcast? I haven't got a clue, but I've recently started watching video game Twitch streamers, and I know that OBS is a piece of software I can use. So
Hmm.
okay, I'm going to use OBS and Twitch, and I'm going to get together with a couple of my buddies, and we're going to come up with some topics, and we're going to do a weekly stream, and we're going to put information out into the world in a way that feels organic to us in a conversational format. So that's what we're doing for now. I still have hopes that a book is coming. I still have asmwbook.com is a website that I registered, and it just redirects to a landing page with some of my other links right now. But
Hmm.
um, I'm hoping to make a private blog soon. I was actually hoping to do it before this interview, but life has been too busy for me to bother setting up a WordPress. And I already have a WordPress where I'm posting reviews right now on maltrunners.com. And, I'm posting reviews on Instagram. And um, Twitter is now dying the slow death. Don't need to get into that. I've pretty much stopped, but I uninstalled the app and I don't post on Twitter much anymore.
That's where I am too. Like as
Has the
soon as
book
you
writing
decide.
commenced? I'll answer that question in the comments. Yes, the book writing has commenced. I was on a plane and I wrote, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 words of various front matter for the book, like introduction and like sort of an overview of how I want the book to go. When I started reaching out for interviews with producers, I sort of sent them my book outline, right? I here's the book outline as a way of begging the questions that you can answer. Like, I want to know about your choices of barley and your choice of yeast and your choice of still and your choice of barrels and whether or not to peat and other sorts of, or whether you're going to smoke the barley with something other than peat, which is a really interesting topic that I wish we had time to talk about, but we're already over 2 hours. Um, I will be talking about that more on my podcast though.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I sent that book outline. And basically the idea was, I wanted to ask as many of those questions to as many of the right people as possible and start filling in the outline of the book and having primary references and then figure out more questions to ask. So in a sense that, so there is some prose that is written and there's
Hmm.
primary research conducted and there's an outline written, and I think as much as not, that is the book writing process. So I'm comfortable saying that the book writing is underway.
Sounds like you're 10% of the way, right? Because the average chapter in a novel is going to be 4 or 5 thousand words,
Yeah, and
and
I
in it,
wrote 8,000 words on the topic of what is American single malt when the regulation proposal came out.
right,
That
and so
that
you're
uh
you're
that
you're
Medium
at a
article is
place
23
where
minute read, something like that.
you're probably looking for 10 or 12 chapters for this type of a book, if I had to guess. And so you're about 10% of the way there with
Yep.
just the thing that you've already written.
Yep.
Um,
I need to put some reviews in there, get some more photography because I've been
mhm.
using a cell phone camera and I need to get like a real camera and go revisit these distilleries, and
I
maybe
mean,
the cell phone camera pictures are enough. I don't know. But the
here's
publisher's
the
probably
thing.
going to
Like,
tell me
okay,
to.
so are you gonna print in full color?
I feel like that's actually an interesting question. I want to,
Because
but
if you're going to print in full color with glossy pages, then maybe the camera matters.
yeah,
But if you're going to print in full color with non-glossy pages, then the camera probably doesn't matter because you're going to start losing resolution. Like,
yeah,
and realistically, at least with, I don't know, maybe you're an Android guy. I don't know, maybe you're an iPhone guy. Doesn't matter. Uh, the camera resolution on most cell phones at this point are better than a $2,000 camera was 10 years ago.
yeah. So
Like
we have
it's
like
it's
a
obscene.
couple of DSLRs in the cabinet that don't make. They're a lot more trouble and they don't make as good pictures as the cell phones do.
Not without
Um,
not without significant work to make sure
yeah.
your f stops correctly. Like, My
Yeah.
wife is the
I
artist,
dabbled in
and she does that.
photography years and years and years ago, back when a DSLR was absolutely the best thing that you could have, and now it just, yeah, it
There are two in this
feels,
closet right here that belong to my wife. I did. Nah, it's not for me. Cell phone
yeah,
will do a really really good job. Now,
yeah.
if you get to the point to where someone else is wanting to publish, then they may pay for the art themselves, but that's their problem, not yours. If
Yeah,
it's a
and so
self
there's a couple of
published,
ways this could go. Like, do I put reviews in it or not? I don't know. I haven't decided. If I put reviews, if I don't put reviews, what pictures am I going to put in the book?
well, you got
Personally,
to
I think,
dramatize it enough too, so you can also make the documentary. Like
oh yeah,
there's a
true.
movie
Yeah,
here.
you've got to plan the media empire.
Right, because you've got the success of the Neat, and then there is the Empire Rye documentary that's been created. There's the women in whiskey are doing a documentary. Like, you can capitalize on the popularity of a documentary real quickly. And you can end up
I
being
can't.
like the Fred Minnick of the American single malt world, right? Because
All of a sudden, I'm blanking on that documentary. That, oh, The Water of Life,
there you go.
that
Yeah.
just came out. And we're me and my co-hosts are going is on our to-do list to watch that documentary, and
Mhm.
then have an episode where we discuss it
You're not
because
gonna do like a watch along on Twitch, like where you watch it while you're on a stream.
so that's tricky because I'm all about following rules,
Yep.
and copyrighted content getting streamed through Twitch is a no-no, even if you could maybe get away with it.
Even
So,
what if you get permission?
hey, that's a question that I hadn't thought to ask. There you go. I'll ponder that. I'll
It's
see what I can do.
publicity, right? Like,
Yeah.
you got to look at it from this point. Like, the worst that someone can do is tell you no.
Yeah, that's fair. I know, like, with video game streamers, is like if you just stream like unedited video game content with, like, there's nothing else on screen and there's no commentary or anything like that, that's considered bad. But as soon
Mm-hmm.
as you put your video stream
Yourself.
on top of it and you
Yep.
start talking over it and you're like doing fun things and interacting
That's what I'm saying. Like,
with
so
your
you've got
audience,
you and two other
yeah,
guys that are sitting around watching this movie. Now you have made it discernibly different. It's not significantly different than, if you were to stream to YouTube while you're watching someone's music video and live reacting to it, right? Like, this is a thing
yeah,
that happens.
yeah.
You're making a.
Speaking of, there's a category of reviews that I've been pondering doing for a long time, and I like, just because of how much effort it would be and distract me from everything else I would like to do. As a person who's into music, especially classical music and whiskey, I felt like it would be cool to do a review series where I review a performance of a classical piece and review a
Pair the
whiskey at the
whiskey with
same
it.
time. Yeah, like
Yeah.
a whiskey, like, say here's a whiskey that makes sense to pour with, I don't know, Beethoven's Seventh Symphony,
Mhm.
and here's my review
Yeah,
of
I've got a
Beethoven's
whole
Seventh
list of
Symphony,
like
and
different like mid '90s grunge rock and what pairs with it, or mid '90s at hip hop things that were real popular whenever I was in middle school, and what whiskey needs. Like, I'm with you. Like, this is a thing that you've got the classical route. Yeah. I've got the same list, just a different genre of music altogether.
yeah. Aside from classical music, I'll just weigh in on what else I'm listening to recently. Um, I find myself more and more often gravitating towards things that are pop adjacent. Like,
Hmm.
I'm not necessarily a fan of a lot of the stuff that turns up in the top 40. Um, but Dua Lipa, I really like for some reason.
Yep.
Um, John Mayer, Jason Mraz, and Jack Johnson. I'm sort of less interested in Jack Johnson these days. Like, that sort of he's got great music and he puts on an excellent live show, I will say. Just a few years ago I went to see Jack Johnson. A double header same weekend at the Gorge in sort of just east of the mountains in Washington. Beautiful venue. 2 nights, John Mayer the first night, and Jack Johnson the next night. And I'm a huge fan of John Mayer, but Jack Johnson put on a better show that night. It just,
I mean,
like, he
he's been
really knew
touring
how to play
twice
to
as
the
long as
audience.
John Mayer.
Yeah, it's
Like,
actually
Jack
kind of
Johnson's been
wild to
around
think about how
forever.
long he's been doing it and how much music he's put out. So, like, the fact that I say, like, if you randomly, like, I have a playlist of, like, it's almost 200 Jack Johnson tracks, and you put it on random shuffle, and it pretty much sound like, no matter where it starts in the playlist, it pretty much sounds the same except for a couple of hits that stand out. There's like a whole lot of the same sort of like surfer beach vibes that, like, or like road trip vibes. I remember listening to Jack Johnson on like a 2-hour road trip down to if I'm not mistaken, it was Corpus Christi, and then we went for a drive on the beach. And this was for a school competition. I don't know how he pulled it off, but my teacher like rented a convertible like through the school to take like the 3 or 4 guys that were going to this competition on a road trip in a convertible car, and yeah, like top down listening to all kinds of stuff. um yeah, fun times.
I
But
can't believe
anyway,
Jack
during that
Johnson is
show
still
he played
touring.
everything that stood out super distinctively, like all the hits that you know, and like the stuff from the Curious George stuff he made sure to play
Hmm.
before sunset so the kids could go to sleep and the parents could still stay up and listen to the rest of the show until 10 p.m.
Right. All right. So we've got you've got a book to make. Now you've got to outline the docu series that goes along with it. What
Have me back on the podcast when I actually have the book in writing, in publication, publicity stage, I guess.
I have an interest in talking to authors. I've had a few on. Um, what like and I think you sort of touched on it, but like what made you distinctly feel like, you know what, the thing that is missing from whiskey podcasting is my voice. Like what was the
Yeah.
thing that hit that?
Uh, I feel like any answer to that verges on the conceited. Um, so I sort of like, to be self-deprecating. I like the sound of my own voice.
Hmm.
So whether that's an in writing form or in actual audio form, um, that's what people would say about me. I talk a lot. I'm the sort of person, if I know a topic, I will never stop talking on it. And more than just being the occasional podcast guest, that made me feel like I had enough to say that I could have a podcast.
Hmm.
Um, like it wasn't worried. Like, I guess look at it another way. I felt I had information that I wanted to put out into the world. I had some industry connections by way of Joe O'Sullivan, who introduced me to Jared Himstead and sort of got me started on the whole. I can get in touch with American single malt whiskey producers. They kind of know who I am. They've heard about me maybe in passing at
Hmm.
commission meetings or whatever, because Joe's been a great proponent of my efforts to become more expert in American single malt whiskey and write about it in reviews and otherwise with some level of authority, I guess, at least as a person who has a mouth, both for tasting and for talking. Um, yeah, I guess it was more that I sort of asked myself, why not? I had friends say, like, you should write a blog. You should share this information with more people than just the people sitting in this room. I had a lot of people encouraging me to do something, and I kind of have just been trying to figure out what fits well. So, I tried the writing reviews and doing nothing else. I tried doing the pictures and reviews on social media and felt like that didn't hit as well with me, like how I felt comfortable doing it. When I did the interviews, that felt like I don't yet feel I'm doing it as well as other interviewers that I respect. You mentioned Whiskey in My Wedding Ring. Um,
Hmm.
the One Nation Under Whiskey guys, I think they talk about their own brand and their own knowledge super well, and they also do really good interviews. Those are the sorts of people that I look up to. I think they're way better at it than I am, but I want to get there. So it's
And it
like a
depends on what
skill.
type of interview you're trying to do. Because David, I consider David a friend. We've spent time one on one together a number of times, but his interview style and mine is distinctly different, and I would never try to compete with his because he's far better at that than I am. But I listen to his to find questions that I want to ask whenever I listen to him talking to somebody else. I'm like, all right, now you're talking the nerdy thing. I'm gonna log this to ask them about um, their Whole 30 that they did, which is a thing that we
Oh,
share in
hey,
common, right?
good
Or
segue.
any other number of like just real weird things, right? Because I want the different conversation that he's doing. But I understand that, and I think you said a phrase in here, and I think you can take it or leave it. I think you've created your own tagline for your podcast because you are a person who has a mouth for both tasting and talking. That is quite possibly one of the best. I think that's beautiful. I think you should use that as a tagline for whatever audio venture that you're using. Because everybody's got to have a clever one, right? Whatever it happens to be. Um, that was best. I like that was good enough. I wrote it down. Like if
Nice.
you
Yeah.
don't use it,
I'll
I'm stealing it.
Oh, I'm gonna take it. I dibs.
Well, you don't have to call dibs. Like there's literally video evidence of you saying it first.
That's right. I copyrighted it live. Yeah. Yeah, you want to talk about Whole30?
Yeah. Well, so I was gonna say, and you may experience this, you may not, but every 6 months, I end up asking myself that exact question. Like, you ever watch The Office? You ever watch the
Yeah,
TV show
yeah,
The
a little
Office?
bit. Yeah.
Okay. There was
I'm
a there
more
was
of
an
a Parks and
episode.
Rec fan. I kind of
They're
I
the same
bounced
show,
off of
just
The
different.
Office a little bit. It's just a
Yeah.
different tone. But yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, there's an episode where Michael's asking a guy like, "What gives you the right?" And like, I regularly find myself every 6 months or so looking in the mirror and be like, "What gives you the right to think that you should have a podcast? Like, why do you think you have a voice? Maybe
Yeah.
you suffer from that, maybe you don't, but you've got a
I
great
almost would phrase
reason
it a
why now."
different way.
Hmm.
A question that was asked to me in the form of like mentorship at work is like there was a project that I wanted to take on that like wasn't being assigned to me and wasn't necessarily associated with my expertise at work or my work
Hmm.
responsibilities or whatever. There's a project that I wanted to do. I went to my manager and I said, "Hey, can I do this essentially extracurricular project? Like, can I spend some time on this? Some hours on a Friday or whatever." And he said, "I'm not going to say no to you." Something along the lines of like, "I'm not going to say no to that because if it's something you want to do, you should do it. Instead, I'm going to ask you, why you?"
Hmm.
Right? Of all the people who could be doing this project, why is it a project that I should be doing?
What's specifically unique about you that helps this particular project?
Right. Or, what about my interests makes it better that I participate as opposed to somebody else?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't even
So
have to
I
name
do.
the other person, but it's like whoever it is.
Yeah, I do ask myself that. I would say,
Hmm.
I don't know if you do New Year's resolutions. I don't really like New Year's resolutions because it's like it's too big of a thing to say I'm gonna make this goal for the year. What I do instead is, and not necessarily on a schedule, but something like quarterly. I will give myself some goals, and across I am a man of many hobbies. Just as pertains to the DemiTastes brand, I do whiskey and coffee and other spirits and blog writing and interviewing and podcasting, and none of this is my day job,
Hmm.
right? I work uh 50, 60 hours a week, at a tech job, and then I'm trying to fit all this other stuff in. And on top of that, I also am an athlete. I train for 4 to 6 hours a week.
Hmm.
Um, and I need to cook, and, I make myself coffee in a not a necessarily a quick way, like every day. And I play music 2 hours a week or more if I'm actually
Hmm.
practicing, which I don't do enough. Um, I'm fitting all of this stuff around, and then I was on the board of my orchestra for a while, and at some
Hmm.
point, I started asking myself, why me? There was a certain guilt of like, if I leave, who else is going to do this job? And that went away when the board cycled and we had enough knowledge transfer that other people could do it. And at some point, they said like, "Hey, do you want to take a break?" And I said, "Oh yes, absolutely yes." It was never easier to say yes to, "Do you want to stop doing something?" Is not
Hmm.
something I don't usually stop doing things, right? But when they said, "Hey, like, do you want to take a break?" I was like, "Absolutely yes." Like,
If it's
I didn't even think
easy to say
about it.
yes to stopping doing something, then that
Yeah,
definitely means it's time to stop.
yeah. So, and that basically came out of like, on the quarterly basis, I was kind of saying like, I'm not really into this board thing anymore. I don't know if I'm really contributing what I used to be contributing. I'm kind of just doing it because I feel like they need me. It's not something that I'm getting anything out of anymore.
Hmm.
Uh, I sort of traded that in for I started working as an assistant coach, not working, it's a volunteer job. I started doing assistant coaching for my Dragon Boat team. And then I sort of said like, you know, I have this in it's not a different thing so much as I like helping people learn how to do things.
Hmm.
And so like I've been paddling dragon boats for 7 years, 6 years now, something like that. Um, and sometime around the fourth year, I felt like I kept getting good feedback about my technique, and I also know that I'm good at explaining. At least I think I'm good at explaining to people how to do things in a way that might stick with them. So
Hmm.
why don't I actually formalize that in some sense and start like doing some coaching? So this happened to be basically going into I did some coaching classes, and I went in, and we went into 2020, and the pandemic happened, and we had to when we started bringing people back out, it was dockside, everybody wears masks, people get in the boat, coaches stand on the dock, and we're like yelling at the other person like, just intense technique focus, right? It was actually a
Hmm.
really good way to learn how to be a coach.
Hmm.
Is that like it's not even a training plan, right? Training plans are a whole aspect of coaching. Technique is an aspect of coaching that usually has to fit into the training plan. In this context, it was there's nothing but the paddler and the coach and their technique, and you need to figure out what you can tell them that's going to take them the next step better. And it's a mentally exhausting process, both because like you want to make sure that you're saying things in a way that are clear while not offending anybody. Like you have to be careful about like if you're when you're talking about somebody's body,
Yep.
right? You have to be really careful with the words and the phrasing. And especially I'm in my 30s, and dragon boat is a sport full of people in their 50s and 60s and 70s. There's a lot of cancer survivors in dragon
Hmm.
boat. um, the reasons for that are interesting. Go look up if you're interested. Basically, it comes down to that type of sport, that type of motion is good for dealing with some of the side effects of post cancer treatment, like
Hmm.
cancer recovery. So in this specific Northwest area specifically, a lot of cancer survivors sort of get funneled into or find dragon boating, either because of doctors' recommendations or friend recommendations or whatever. And so there's a whole aspect of the team that is cancer survivor stuff, and we do lots of ceremonies and recognition and that sort of thing. Yeah, I
I got
felt
to
I've
put
gone way
dragon
too far
boating.
off on a tangent. Yeah.
No, no, that's, I mean, listen, that's what the name of this particular thing is. Like this is what we're after. Um,
You ever like you're talking for a while and like you're like this is fine, and then all of a sudden you feel like you've just gone too far.
no, I don't know that I have that degree of self awareness. I mean, and maybe that's a problem. Like I need. There's been more than one occasion, at least during the pandemic, when we were all working from home, and like I'm on a meeting and I'm talking, and my wife is in this other office over here, and she's doing, she's an educator, and so she's doing her thing, and I've been talking for a while, and I look over, and she's just sort of staring at me like, "Are you gonna shut up? Like you need to give someone else a chance to talk." And so maybe I don't have that in me in the same way. You mentioned making coffee. What what is your laborious method that you're using to make coffee? Like, are you a pour over guy? Are you pulling espresso
uh,
shots? Like, what's happening
it's
daily?
a very much a I feel thing. Funny enough, I've never owned like a Mr. Coffee type of machine, like the machine
Hmm.
where it's like it grinds the beans for you and you put in some water and you put in the coffee filter in the basket and you just let it run for a while. I've never
Hmm.
owned that kind of machine. Reason why? Coffee from that kind of machine I never liked. And I
Right.
would drink coffee if I needed coffee to get me caffeinated,
Yes.
but I would do
That,
it
that coffee
from
from that machine is for caffeination. Like
right. It's
that
coffee
is
with a
the
job to do. Yeah, it's not meant to
absolutely.
taste good. So like besides that, it was like I would have Starbucks, and like Starbucks is dessert, right? Like you go
Hmm.
there and you get a chocolate sundae with coffee flavor in it or something like that, right? Um, that was like I think a pretty typical coffee experience, and that was my coffee experience for a very long time. Sort of just like whiskey and just like alcohol, I didn't start really drinking coffee until I was maybe I didn't drink coffee for most of college, actually, even. Like the
Yeah, I
occasional
don't know how to,
tea.
like, I'm fine with this, like holding off on drinking alcohol until you're 21. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. But I was drinking coffee when I was like 11. What are you
Yeah,
doing here?
my mom was real good about keeping me away from coffee.
Hmm.
And we would have tea in the afternoon if I needed like some, I needed to wake up a bit to do more homework or whatever. I had a very busy school life too, because I was doing orchestra and swimming and
Yep.
academics all at the same time, and that was every single day was full every hour. So every once in a while I needed some caffeine, but not every day. And it was just tea. Um, and I sort of just took that with me into college, and I kept drinking tea even for the first couple of internships I did. And sometime around when I was 21 or 22 and doing an internship, I had an internship where they had like this automatic coffee making machine, where it's like you
Hmm.
press a few buttons and like 20 seconds later it spits out a cup of coffee. And like
Right.
that's too convenient to ignore.
Right.
Um, and then I did a Whole 30, and I had to cut out sugar and milk. And I'll probably talk about both now.
Hmm.
Whole 30, for anyone who doesn't know, is an elimination diet. It's kind of a fad diet. It's in ways related to keto and paleo, which makes it easy to sort of find food that works for Whole30. Whole30 is like eliminate anything in your diet which might be causing dietary distress or inflammation. Whether there are good
See,
reasons or not, do it anyway, is basically
see,
what the
you
diet
kids
says.
these days. I'm gonna get on my old man bucket here because keto is a relatively new thing, but Whole30 hit in 2011, 12 ish time frame when no one was
Yeah.
talking about keto then. And the first Whole30 that we did in this
Hmm.
house, my wife and I, was around 2012. And so there was no keto friendly foods. It was basically you're going to cook everything for 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, because there's no restaurant that can serve you things that are going to be keto friendly. There's no thing you can buy. It was just like an endless cycle of making dishes. Incredibly
Absolutely.
valuable. Like we were doing it for a lot of reasons. It was, sort of testing out some um, diet restriction after she had given birth to our first child, and like
Hmm.
hormonal imbalance and thyroid problems and whatever. And we did one annually for like 4 years after that. But this is back when like no potatoes were a part of Whole30. Like when it first came out, like you could have no potatoes, and it was like sweet potatoes are okay, and now it's like white potatoes are okay.
Oh, really? They added white potatoes? Interesting. As
I
long as they're
think
not
I
fried, right?
believe I read that recently, but we
I
we
think.
sort of
Do I have
kind of
this
moved
wrong?
past it.
That like so sweet potatoes are yams actually are a different like class of different, I don't know, whatever, somewhat unrelated to potatoes. Right? Yams and like white potatoes are unrelated to a large degree.
Yeah, I mean they're both tubers, in the same way
Yeah.
that a carrot is a tuber. But I think at least from what I remember of reading the book
So like
in
white
15
potatoes are
years ago,
considered a nightshade, I think is the distinction that I'm making there.
there was nothing that precluded a white potato from being Whole30 compliant aside from specifically in North America our reliance on white potatoes
Mm.
for a substantial portion of diet in a
And
way that we
especially
shouldn't.
like fried French
Right,
fries
an
and mashed
unhealthy
potatoes.
relationship
Yeah.
with the potato was the
Right.
reason why they did not have it on the list to begin with. And when they
Right.
brought it in to the discussion, if I remember correctly, it was largely like, okay, this is on the list mainly so you could go out and have dinner somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Because if you can have a potato,
Hmm.
you can probably make it just about anywhere, right?
Right.
But
Salad, potatoes, steak, you're done. Right?
yeah,
Like that's a
and
meal out.
hope that they didn't put butter on something by accident.
Right. Yeah, we did something like that once. I don't remember if I asked about the butter. I think kind of. So, yeah. Um so in college, I had to learn how to cook for myself.
Hmm.
And like it's not that I didn't know how to cook. Like I really liked making garlic shrimp when I was like 13, 14 years old.
Hmm.
And everybody can fry an egg, and like frying vegetables is kind of
But
no
you
big
didn't
deal. And
build up like a repertoire of meals. You had like three
right.
things you could make, and that was it.
Right. Right. So like if I was hungry and my parents were out and I needed to make a snack that was something better than potato chips, because like as an athlete I was thinking about that. Like eat,
Hmm.
if you're hungry, eat healthy food. Eat nourishing, like full of vitamins, protein, whatever. Um so yeah, I had to learn how to make a few things. In college I had to learn how to cook for myself, but it ended up being like a mix of like frozen hamburger patties and frozen fish patties and frozen fish and like some instant meals or some like sauce mixes or that sort of stuff. And then like I would do like a big pot meal.
Hmm.
I love making stew. Beef stew is one of my favorite things to make. Real simple recipe. Like you got to do, the hardest thing is you get the cubed beef shoulder or whatever, and then you coat it in the salt, pepper, flour, and you like sort of stir fry that a bit to sort of brown it, get that Maillard reaction going,
Hmm.
which is something that whiskey nerds should know about because that's one of the flavor contributing factors. Um, but also people who cook and bake know about the
Yep.
Maillard reaction. Maillard reaction. Probably saying it wrong. Now I'm self conscious.
It's I've heard it both ways. I don't know which one's right. I'm from Kentucky. I accept it.
So, yeah, you fry that up, and then you basically just, the rest is just cutting vegetables, right? You put in some carrots, you put in some potatoes, maybe sweet potatoes if you want, celery, um, whatever else you want to put in there, really. And then you top it off with the meat. You put some beef stock in there, put it on the slow cooker. Next morning, you have you have meals for 4 or 5 days, right?
Hmm.
Perfect college cooking. The other thing I really like doing was a big wok of I had like these curry mixes. Like the instructions on this bottle of curry mix was like, you take a scoop of this, you put it in the pan with some sesame oil, you fry it up, and then you put some coconut milk in there. You put some chopped chicken thigh and basically the same vegetables, sweet potatoes, carrots,
Yep.
whatever. You throw that all together, and you got food for 4 or 5 days, right? Chopping broccoli. I didn't mention broccoli, but I'm not sure if I would put broccoli in stew, or I guess you could put it in the curry. I don't think
Hmm.
I did. I didn't do a whole lot with putting broccoli in big pot dishes, but I did stir fry broccoli a lot. Um,
See, ours just
yeah,
went in the oven. It was a lot easier. Just roast it in the oven, let it get a
I
little
didn't
bit
really
black
get
on
into
it.
oven cooking until probably the last couple of years, actually.
See, most of my college jobs were working in a restaurant kitchen, and not like a McDonald's restaurant kitchen or an Applebee's, but we had a couple of local places where I got to learn how to fry and grill and dip, which was anything that was sort of pre-made, and wash dishes and all these different things. So that way, um, I I learned how to cook because I didn't want to eat just stuff out of a box whenever my parents were working, because I grew up in the mid 90s and our parents were never around. We just sort of raised ourselves on TV. And so like, you figure out how to cook a few things, but then like you get to college, you're like, I'm gonna go work in a restaurant. Now you learn how to like cook, like using spices and exploring new
Yeah,
recipes
yeah.
and whatnot.
I was
Um,
always good with spices. My
mhm,
dad used to have me make the spice mixes. Like that was when you're like 8 and you want to help your dad in the kitchen, putting together the spice mix is like a thing you can do that's relatively not dangerous. Like you're
mhm,
not going to burn anything down, you're not going to ruin dinner because like you can always try it, taste it. If it's horrible, like start over, right? Like you got a chance. So like I was good with putting spices together. I had kind of a knack for figuring out interesting spice mixes. Um, One of my favorite, I don't refer to recipes a whole lot because you kind of just have cooking fundamentals. One of my
mhm,
favorite things, though, somebody sent around an Imager album that was just like a glorified blog post that was like, here's steak, but 12 different spice mixes that you can use to make your steak different. So like one was basically a chimichurri, and one was like put harissa paste and a couple of things together and make like a North African steak, and
mhm.
a couple other things like that. And I go back to that list all the time because it's just a fantastic, like, you're making steak, but you just change the spices and you have a completely different meal. Come up with some side dishes
Yeah, I
that
mean,
work.
like, beef has some flavor to it, but largely it's a neutral palate to add a lot of flavor to.
Hmm.
My wife and I were talking about that, like, because there's a distinct flavor for chicken thighs, but if it's chicken breasts, it's also a neutral palate, right? In most
Mm-hmm.
steak,
Mm-hmm.
unless you get something that's super super fatty, like there's this obsession with filet mignon, and like it doesn't have a ton of flavor to me. It's a great place to put salt and pepper, and you get the chewy charred meat and salt and pepper, and that's the flavor that you get from it.
If you got a good quality steak, though, I think you got that the beefy flavor is
Right.
sort of the thing that you're going for sometimes.
Yeah, but see that I think most North American palates are not really wanting a beefy flavor. They don't want anything that's sort of really out there. They want everything sort of to be muted, and so a
Hmm.
lot of what you purchase, even when you purchase premium stuff, is still not going to be, unless you're buying something that's super dry aged, that's lost a lot of moisture content, and it's getting down to its essence flavor. It's still.
Yeah. So
Um,
if you've been on my Instagram recently, you'll see that it's full of. I got a smoker this year.
mhm.
I missed Texas enough, and I have a nice big deck now. After I moved, I decided to get a smoker, and I started smoking briskets, and then I started smoking other things. And recently, I just smoked some sirloins.
Mhm.
I kind of heard that was a thing. I wasn't sure how it would turn out. It's actually really good as that
Yeah,
sort of
I mean, you can
neutral
smoke
palate to
anything.
absorb smoke. Yeah, and as a peated Scotch whiskey lover, put smoke in more things, please and thank you.
So this is the thing, right? So that we'll bring this back around a little bit, and this may be the last thing that we've got. We got a few minutes to talk through this. So in the United States, largely smoky whiskey, nobody's interested in, and very specifically in bourbon country. But also, what is huge in bourbon country is smoked meats, and these two
Hmm.
things run so close, parallelized that, like, what the hell? Like, how do we like? How is this? How is this not a thing? Like, how is smoky whiskey not a thing in a place where we want to consume pounds on pounds on pounds of smoky meat?
That's a really great point, and you're suddenly making me realize that probably my first introduction to smoke was through the excessive smoked meats and so on that you get
You're in Texas.
in
You
the
had
South.
brisket.
Yeah,
You had
yeah,
tons of brisket, like
yeah,
and
and
good
smoked
quality
everything else.
brisket.
And my
And
family,
pork and chicken and all of these things. And the smokier the better. Like if you pull up to a barbecue joint in anywhere in the South and you don't see smoke coming out of the building, you leave, right?
that,
Because
yep, it's true.
they're
It ain't
using liquid
fresh.
smoke and they're liars, right? It's not a real thing.
Yep.
And the introduction of the pelletized grill made things a little bit bastardized, but there's still some smoke to it. But
Yep.
these same
Mine's
people,
a pelletized smoker, and I'm not thinking too hard about it because it's really hard to get good. The problem with brisket around here, there's a lot of people in this area that like have opened up barbecue joints,
yep,
like make we're gonna make smoked brisket ribs and whatever, right? We're gonna do the Texas style barbecue. Um, and I've long contended that pretty much every barbecue place has one meat specialty, and just because their brisket is great doesn't mean that everything else there is great. Just because their
it's
baby back
probably
ribs are
not.
great.
The ribs may be great and the other things may be passable.
Yeah. I could
That's
almost think of specific places where they have this is where you go when you want really good barbecue beef ribs. This
yep.
is the place you go when you want really good baby back ribs. This is
Hmm.
the place you go when you want really good brisket, really good moist brisket. This is the place that you go when you want the awesome homemade Polish sausage barbecue style.
Yes.
Um, and I wouldn't say that I can't those going through that list. I don't think any of those places is the same place. Um, and then like I never really I don't think I found a place that I felt the barbecue chicken or turkey was particularly to my liking, more
Hmm.
so than just having it at home. Like a
Well,
regular old grilled chicken, like a rotisserie grilled chicken at home that's not barbecue style was
it's
better
tough
for
to
me.
same it's going to get dry.
Yeah,
That's
same
what's
with
going to
turkey.
happen to it. It's going to get dry, right?
Yeah.
Like you've got to be very, very good at it. You go to like if you go to a chicken like a smoked chicken competition, you'll find somebody that can do it well. But that's because they stood over top of it. Like it's hard to commercialize that and make it great. So it I don't know, but you're right. Like in our area, there's the place for the ribs. There's a place for the shoulder. There's not a place for brisket. I'm in
Mm,
Kentucky. There's not a
mm,
good place for brisket. But we do have some mutton floating around. Like there's some
mm.
of that's here or there. But
Yeah, I like a good
none of
mutton,
them.
but at home, I don't think I had ever had a Texas style like mutton barbecue. But yeah, we liked making. I have a Bulgarian background, Bulgarian Croatian.
Mhm.
Um, we we sometimes eat like the Middle Eastern food like that. We have like a lamb, the mushwi, mutton, by any other name, right? Like that sort of that whole thing. Um, the sort of stewed pot dishes, like the juvich and like the glorified clay pot stew, right?
Mhm.
Which is like that special style with the spices and whatever way. We did a lot of really good home cooking. And also I grew up in New Jersey and New York, so um, we had like the sort of Italian and like the smoked the deli meats and
Yep.
the pastrami sandwiches and the Reubens
Yes, the
and the
thing that you
charcuterie
can't
type
get a
stuff.
good
Yeah.
one anywhere in the state of Kentucky. Like there's not going
Yeah.
to be a good pastrami or a Reuben
Yeah.
largely in this entire state. You're going to have to fly somewhere to
Or
get
or
access to
make it
something like
yourself.
this
So you
good.
learn how to make these things because
Yeah.
you're not going to get a good one. So yeah, up in this area, there's people who claim to do Texas barbecue, and there's people who aren't from Texas who say this stuff is good. I had the manager of my manager at my old company for a long time was also from Central Texas, and we commiserated often over the fact that every time a new barbecue place opened up that was supposed to be good, a new Texas barbecue place, we would go and try it, and it just isn't there. It just isn't the thing.
Yep.
It just
Well,
doesn't quite do it.
and it's the people that are saying that it's good. They don't understand what Texas barbecue actually was. They may have had barbecue in Texas one time,
Hmm.
but it was probably some borderline chain joint
Hmm.
that was, whatever. And the barbecue is subjectively good,
Hmm.
but if you're putting it on the measuring stick of Texas brisket or Kansas City ribs, or North Carolina pulled pork or whatever, then it doesn't measure up to those things, right? But you have that like resource of knowledge of like, oh,
Yeah.
this is not it, guys.
This
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 is
comes
not it.
back to that buy local, right? Like you find
Yep.
your good local barbecue joints. Some of the places are like good enough to be worth traveling for. Like if you ever find yourself in Central Texas and you happen to be driving from like Waco to Houston, you'll go near a town called Lockhart. And there's a barbecue place in there called Black's, and they have the best beef ribs there.
Hmm.
Black's Barbecue in Lockhart, Texas. They have a spot in Austin now, I think. I haven't tried it, so I can't say whether it's as good. But like it's even though they have another location, they're very much local. Franklin's Barbecue in Austin, which like everybody has heard of, there's a line out the door all the time. Place burned down. That's how you know it's legit. They moved to a different location, or there's still a line out the door. Right? They also have excellent beef ribs, but you're going to be waiting forever. Like
Right.
literally, um, I went to visit Austin and dedicated an entire day to camping in line for barbecue ribs. I don't camp for bourbon. I camp for ribs.
So my question is so you've got this place, Lockhart. eh, would it have been better for you to just drive to them and come back than wait in line all day long? Like, could you have done
It
that time
probably
frame
would have been,
wise?
but I didn't know that that was there at the time. We figured that
Ah,
out later. But yeah, we literally have made the drive from Houston to Lockhart and back, and it was so good it didn't even register with me that that was 5 hours of driving, 2.5 hours each direction, basically.
right. Yeah. I mean, like it. When you live in rural America and you have to drive a long distance to get it, anything, you sort of understand these things. And I have, and we'll probably close with this, but I have this one distinct barbecue experience. My wife and I were driving through Alabama on our way to vacation at the beach. And on the way down, like we stopped and picked up lunch somewhere, and we go through, and it's like we hit this billboard, and it's just like the 20 2006 world champion barbecue restaurant, whatever, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm logging this in my brain because this is a Kansas City barbecue competition, so there's a legitimate nature to what they're doing here. This place probably has good barbecue. We're gonna hit it on the way back. When we come back from vacation, we're gonna stop at this place. Remember, it's got a black sign. It's shaped like a pig. Unique billboard, black sign shaped like a pig. So we're rolling back through, a week later, and we see the sign, black sign shaped like a pig, voted best barbecue, right? So we pull off. And I'm super excited because it's like barbecue. It's like a thing. It's like a southern thing, whether it's pork or it's beef or whatever. Like, heck yeah. We pull in and it's got all the markings. You go inside and it's like 1970s wood paneling, and it's pictures of people's family on the wall, and there's like an old person running the cash register, and it's like a push button cash register. There's no like screen to it, so it has all the markings of what's going to be great barbecue. And I have never eaten something that was closer to a hot circle of garbage in my life. It was awful. It was terrible. And like we're super let down. We're super disappointed. And so, we eat the bread and we eat around the edges, and the baked beans taste like they came straight out of a can. Like the whole experience was just blown. And we get in the car and we're both super let down because, she was excited about it. Mainly for me, not in the same level. And we get in the car and drive maybe like an hour and a half. And then I see another billboard, the exact same shape. Right. This restaurant had started putting billboards up, and they were like voted the best barbecue in their city, and so they obscurely advertised it, right, to catch people on the way back, like on the way back, because this is a primary path to go to the beach. We pull in this other place, and I'm already full from the hot circle of garbage restaurant where we ate fries or whatever else, and it's like drive through only. There's stacks of wood around the outside of it. There's an old dude with like one eye that's running the cash register and also the pit at the same time. And I'm like, this is what it's
This is
supposed to
it.
be.
This is
It
it.
was.
This
It
is the
was
place.
one of the best places. Like that's how you decide. Like you may have made a good choice. Like if you feel like you have an equal chance of getting robbed or getting good food, you're probably at the right place for good barbecue.
Yeah.
Like that's the marker. But the same people who love that also want to crap on smoky whiskey, and I don't understand it.
Well, we could just close on this sentiment. More for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. So we need to hit any places that you want people to find you, to reach out to you, to contact you, to follow you, right? They're in the show notes, but go ahead and give them that as well.
Yeah, I'm DemiTastes everywhere. You can find me on Discord at the Whiskey Lodge. Um, you can find me on except on Reddit, I'm Demi Reticent because I made that username before. You can't change your username on Reddit, so you know that sucks. Yeah, so Demi Reticent on Reddit. That's where you can find my reviews. That's like for better or worse. That's my biggest review archive all in one place. I'm working on making it on the blog. Find me at demitastes.com. Keep an eye on asmwbook.com for when that lights up with information about the book to come. Um, you can also find me on Twitter, where I'm not really hanging out anymore. You can find me on Instagram uh, as DemiTastes. Also, Threads, I'm DemiTastes. But like, who's really using Threads? It's like it's. I want it
The
to
ghost
work.
town.
I want it to work, but like somehow it just doesn't seem to. It's not reaching that critical mass of whiskey nerdery that needs to be there before it's a good place to hang out. But yeah, I do still check Twitter. If you want to get in touch with me on Twitter, you can do that. You can also send me an email at doug@demitastes.com or demitaste@gmail.com. I have that as well. Um, yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Discord is pretty much going to be the best way. I mean, I'm on Instagram more often than anything else besides Discord. So
Mhm.
like Discord and Instagram probably the best way. You can send me a private message on either one of them. I'll be more likely if you're on Discord. I'll be more likely to see your message if you join the Whiskey Lodge first because I have the notification settings down to prevent spam. Um, you absolutely should join the Whiskey Lodge. I sort of said to myself I would try to be less of an advocate for myself and more of an advocate for the Whiskey Lodge. The Whiskey Lodge is the place where I learned almost everything that I know about
Mhm.
whiskey, or at least inspired me to ask the right questions to help me learn everything that I know about whiskey now. We love beginners. We love making recommendations. So if you're and also we have tons of expert people in there. I would call them experts, right? We have tons of people
Mhm.
who really know what they're talking about. Scotch, independent bottlings, I didn't know anything about before I met people there. Basically, any question you have at any level of whiskey geekery, we can help you. Um, we also, if you're looking for a community to do a quarterly dry week, we do that extremely regularly. We take that really seriously because health is important when you're consuming poison for a hobby. Um, we have some producers join in with us on the dry week thing because we've convinced that they already know, but having a community, right, we've convinced them that we're a community worth doing it with. So I take pride in that. Look forward to seeing you all, and thanks for we've been going for 3 hours. If you're still hearing me talk about these places that you should go check me out, I really appreciate you sticking around.
Yeah, there's still folks here. Like I see the count in the corner, and I'll echo the Discord comments. Because I hopped on today, just kind of feeling it out, and seeing what's here, and I've got to go through the backlog of everything that's been said, so that way, you're not the new guy who says something that that we said this 3 weeks ago. Shut up, new guy. That kind of thing. But one of the things that did catch me right off the bat was the mention of Dry Week and the list of addiction resources for substance abuse organizations. Like, there's a very concerted effort to make sure that the members are sort of treating this hobby of ours very respectfully, because it can be very, very harmful to a very distinct segment of people. And I've seen some folks who were in this whiskey podcasting game that have left as a result of wanting to kind of like check their um, own personal relationship with alcohol. So there's a lot of like I'm in one, two, three, four, at least 15 different Discord channels. Most of them have to do with whiskey. This is the first one that I've came across that's like a primary thing that's like right in your face as you hop on. So kudos to you guys. It's absolutely appropriate. One of the things that I am going to call out here is that I sent you a list of questions we were going to talk about. And there were like 9 things, and we talked about 3.
Yeah.
So this is probably going to have to happen again. Like we're
Yeah,
probably
I'm
going to
up for
have to
it.
do some more and have another conversation. But I expect you to have at least 20 or 30 more pages on the book done before we talk again. So that way we can kind of talk about it.
Hey, that's a
So
fair
you got to
goal.
set the
Yeah.
goal. Yeah, 20 or 30 pages. It's what you got to have done. I'm gonna be your was it editor. Editors are the ones that tell you when you have to have pages done. That's what it
Producer? I
is.
don't know. Producers for media.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
whatever.
I don't know
Whatever. I
what it
got it.
is. I think it's a book
Manager?
editor. I don't know. I've got a friend that wrote a book. That's not a thing for me. Like, like any good '90s kid, I started up 17 different blogs, and after about 2 weeks, it was like, this isn't really
Oh
a
man.
thing for me.
Oh, telling
It's
me about
not
the
going to be an
90s kids
option.
blogs. Yeah. I happily burned one to the ground. I was able to delete everything.
I'm not going to talk about what they were because they likely still exist. If you were going to, the Wayback Machine or archive.org or something like, you could probably still find it. And nobody needs to read any of that. Not like there
Yep.
was anything
No.
offensive. It was just like not good
It
writing. Is what
wasn't
it was.
coherent, I think is probably the most charitable way of putting it.
No one should have given us access to be able to write things. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't a reasonable
Who would
situation. So
let kids on the internet? Let's not go down
parents
to
of
let's not
80s
go
and
down
90s
that.
kids, because they were not there. But
Parents
that's
of
also another conversation. But back to the
parents of
therapist.
2010s and 2020s kids also, and they have tablets now.
Right, yeah. So I'm gonna put you in the green room. I'm gonna close out here.
Yeah, sounds
Thank
good.
you for hopping on and having the conversation. It's been super interesting, and we're gonna have to do this again. Thanks for tuning in for this offering from the Embellish Podcast. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you have to be consuming this on. Leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media at Twitter or Instagram using EmbellishPod, or give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can also be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, contact details, and more. Thanks for stopping by.